again thank our hosts for tonight, Addison Central School District and the Hannaford Career Center. Wendy Baker is here, as is Nicole Tavish, our two superintendents. Those who were able to be early got a wonderful meal. We're really appreciative of the setup and the setup for later this evening. So thank you. Wendy, do you want to say anything? Or
yeah, I mean, it's wonderful to be able to be of service and supporting your work. Your work already has informed some of the work that we've done in the district. So we've been following along, and we understand this is an exciting day for you. So we're happy to be a part of it. And this evening at the high school, we hope we'll have a nice public turnout. So we look forward to supporting you in that too.
Great, thank you. Nicole, no obligation, but you're welcome.
No, we are just thrilled to be able to host today, to see your work. We are all watching closely and looking forward to what you all determine. So thank you for coming.
Thank you. I will have the commission do roll call. We'll do the folks in the room first, and then we have a few members on the screen. Just a quick reminder, although it looks like everyone's already doing this, if you are joining us on the screen from the public, if you are able to keep your screen off until and if you are speaking, that just helps keep commission members on the first page. So I'm Megan Roy. I am the chair and on the commission as a former member of the Act 173 advisory group.
Jay Nichols, appointee for the Vermont Principals Association.
Mike Licklider, Superintendent of Harwood Unified Union School District and representative of the Vermont Superintendents Association.
Peter Gallman, chair of the House Education Committee and the member appointed from the House.
Nicole Mason on the Board of Trustees for the Winooski School District, and I'm here representing the Vermont School Boards Association.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education, representing Education.
Oliver Olson, I'm the appointee of the Vermont Independent Schools Association.
Good afternoon, Jennifer Depp Samuelson. I'm the chair of the Vermont State Board of Education.
Good afternoon, John Castle. I'm Executive Director of the Vermont Rural Education Collaborative.
Jeff Bennett, Executive Director of Vermont NEA and Vermont NEA appointee.
Great. Anne, I see you first on the screen.
Yeah. Ann Cummings, Chair of the Senate Finance Committee, and I represent the Vermont Senate.
Thank you. And Craig?
Good afternoon. I'm Craig Bolio, the Vermont Tax Commissioner.
And Elizabeth, I think I saw you on the screen. Maybe not. Elizabeth Jennings is our representative from the Vermont Association of School Business Managers Association. So are there any amendments to the agenda? Oliver?
Madam Chair, I was going to suggest perhaps that we move the discussion of the report up after the first public comment period. It struck me that 30 minutes towards the end of the meeting may not be sufficient to really have the kind of discussion I think we need to have on the board.
Yeah, a question I would have for you, Zoe. I know you're doing a little bit of a data overview. The timing of the agenda was meant to, I didn't give that as much time as it is there. So how much time do you need? And would that be helpful to do before the report discussion? It does feel like, sorry, I should have said that differently. It feels like looking at data is important before we have the discussion, but I don't know how much time you are thinking you needed.
I can run through that in 20 minutes. I put together
Okay.
simple slides just to give a high level overview of the topic.
Okay. Are folks comfortable with that? I think it doesn't actually change the order. I don't think there are very many subcommittee reports. I think the bulk of today's discussion. So I think that will be relatively quick. And I think we'll end up with quite a bit more time than 30 minutes for that. Are folks okay with that? Any other adjustments? I know there was a question about the December 1 tax letter, but I'm not sure that it has hit yet.
That is accurate. It has not been
Thank you.
released yet.
Okay, so we don't need to add.
I expect it shall at some point during the meeting.
Great.
I do think referencing that
In our
letter is
report.
going to be needed as part of the report. So if and when the breaking news comes, if we could take a minutes to just hear from Craig on the highlights and just connect that to the board.
Yeah, I think that's important. Okay. Can I have a motion to approve our minutes from our November 4th meeting? Thanks, Jennifer. Second.
Second?
Thanks, Peter. Any discussion? All those in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, motion carries. We have about 15 minutes for public comment in this part of the meeting. We'll have another opportunity at the end of the meeting. We typically have alternated between in the room and on the screen. So is there anyone in the room who wishes to address? Okay, I see two. Folks on the screen, if you are interested, just put your hand up and we'll alternate. Ken, do you want to go first?
Sure, thank you.
Yep.
I'll step over here, maybe cameraman. Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ken Fredette from Wallingford, Friends of Vermont Public Education as well. And I know you have a pressing deadline to meet, so I'll be brief. In fact, I wasn't planning on doing anything more than wishing you well today in your task at hand. But then on Thanksgiving morning, I opened up the Rutland Herald and saw this headline that Belden Construction is seeking tax stabilization on a proposed hotel project in downtown Rutland. So I decided that I would bang on my tax increment financing district drum one more time before you have to issue your report 13 days hence. I'll refer you to my testimony in the attached commentary on September 9th to how I formed my opinion on TIFs. But the gist of it is, I don't object to TIFs in and of themselves. I think a lot of good can come out of them. I just object to the revenue source being property taxes. And one municipality the voters can approve a TIF, and property owners throughout the state of Vermont foot the bill for that. It kind of flies in the face of the common benefits clause of our Vermont Constitution. And also, it seemed like taxation without representation. But of course, the counter to all that is that people get their money back down the road. Eventually, maybe, unless they don't. Now we have this developer trying to circumvent the process by asking the value of this multi-story hotel in downtown Rutland be set at $400,000 for 10 years. So that pushes the return on investment on the TIF bonds even further out. So, I object to that. It just like kind of goes counter to the whole point of TIFs. At a time when alleviating the tax burden on Vermont property owners is rightly very high up, if not at the top of the legislative agenda, I suggest that I once again point to TIFs as low-hanging fruit that could help achieve that end, and suggest to this commission once again to recommend an immediate moratorium on TIF funding until such time as legislation can be crafted to provide for a revenue source that is broader than just Vermont property owners. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. I'm going to go to someone on the screen. Nancy Cornell, do you want to turn your camera on?
Thank you. I'm Nancy Cornell. I'm former associate superintendent and curriculum coordinator for 23 years in Rutland Northeast and the former Addison Northeast. And I am also have served on the supervisory union board of the Addison Northeast Supervisory Union for many years before I was associate superintendent and afterwards. I'll be pretty brief. We can certainly all appreciate and be concerned about the time constraints that the commission is working under, and we can all, I think, appreciate the work that you have already done. It's a complex issue that you're working on, and you've got a tight timeline that is making it infinitely more difficult. I have several recommendations about the draft that's before you today and about the commission's work going forward. I think it's going to be really important to remove the section that you've written on school size on pages 21 and 22. The commission really has not done anything near a deep dive into the value that small rural schools can provide to kids and communities, and that kind of deep dive is going to be essential. Although Act 46 required it, there has not been any thorough analysis of the effects of school and school district consolidation that have taken place under Act 46. And really, the commission should make no recommendations regarding further school or school district consolidation until that analysis is completed by a recognized independent research team. In keeping with Angelo Lynn's recent editorial in the Addison Independent, before we go making any blanket decisions about closing schools, let's be sure we have a grand plan. In not too many years, the many elders in Vermont towns will inevitably leave this earth, leaving behind a boatload of desirable available housing. Wouldn't it be a shame to discover at that point that we need more community schools for the young families who will want to and who will be able to settle here? Wouldn't it be great if if our state could devise a school funding and administrative system that accommodates the very predictable generational ebb and flow of our population? Our small rural schools are really important to our small rural towns. They're not all perfect. There are some great ones and there are some ones that need improvement. But we need to be really very, very careful not to make blanket decisions about this very key resource that is so important to our kids and also to our communities. Thanks.
Thank you, Nancy. In the room?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Commission and community members. My name is Jeannie Albert. I'm a retired mathematics professor, and I currently serve as chair of the Lincoln School District Board. I appreciate the Commission's stated commitment to using data and evidence to guide its decisions and recommendations. I recognize it has been a challenge to get all the data and information you've identified as critical to your mission, especially given the very tight statutory timeline. As you've noted, our complex education finance system is comprised of many interwoven threads. Today, I want to share some preliminary analysis and comparisons I've done regarding supervisory union and supervisory district structure and spending in Vermont. I hope these results will inform your discussions in a useful way. Using AOE governance types, I classified Vermont's supervisory unions into three categories: single town city SDs, merged or unified union SDs, and unmerged SUs with at least 2 districts. I then looked at budgeted spending per equalized or weighted pupils for 3 fiscal years, 2018, 2023, and 2025, and calculated summary statistics for each of the categories. Across all years, it turned out that merged SDs consistently had the highest spending per pupil, whether it's equalized pupil or LTW-AVM. I'm sharing these calculations to provide context for some of the options displayed under school size in the Finance Subcommittee's brainstorm spreadsheet. In version 2, which I believe is the most recent, the quote, fiscal impact when fully realized, unquote, of merging schools and districts is appropriately classified as unclear. Given that merged SDs in Vermont have consistently higher per pupil spending on average than other SU governance structures, it's unwise to recommend creating additional merged entities before gaining a more complete understanding of why this is happening. For example, a more thorough analysis could identify whether and to what extent additional central office structures in merged supervisory districts contribute to this difference in spending and could reveal valuable insights about variation of spending across all supervisory structures. While it may be a reasonable hypothesis that merged governance structures facilitate reduced spending compared to other models, the data in Vermont do not support this conclusion. Crucially, Table 2, potential policy actions of the Commission's preliminary draft, displays a condensed version of this of the brainstorm spreadsheet in which this unclear fiscal impact that I've just noted does not appear. It would be unfortunate if the report to the legislature omits this assessment by the Finance Subcommittee, especially in light of the results I'm sharing with you now. As you've acknowledged in your draft report, quote, clear, valid, and accurate data is essential at all levels of the Commission's work, quote. I present these results as support for the Commission's commitment to an evidence-based process. And I can submit this, but later in these prepared remarks, I've also included related Vermont-specific data regarding education spending and school closure. And I'm happy to answer questions or provide further information.
Thank you. Next, I believe on the screen, Chris Young.
Thank you, folks. My name is Chris Young. I am the principal at North Country Union High School and the president-elect for VPA. I also come from a family of educators. Both my parents and grandparents were either school board members or teachers in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont for their entire lives. And both my kids, as well as myself, went to North Country. So I have an admittedly biased view of public education in rural areas. And as a principal for 23 years in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, I think I have a unique view of what it takes to educate students in our areas. I really do appreciate the Commission's initial report, preliminary draft, because it acknowledges the complexity of the issues that we're facing as a state, and excuse me, especially that there's no one solution, and it's really a breath of fresh air to not have us point to spending as the way to address all of our issues as a state. I do think that we're at a very unique and potentially fortuitous point in our conversation as a state about what do we want to be when we grow up as a state educational system. And that is, I think, around the nation, there's a conversation that has either been had or is being had at other states where education is being turned into a consumable, into a commodity that is only a means to an end. And I think it sounds like a per pupil expenditure that can be transferred to wherever folks want and can be used to attain admission to a great college, or it can be used to get a great paying job. And I just urge the Commission to really avoid that trap. I think it can be really dangerous for us as a state to turn education into a consumable and not appreciate the fact that it should be a public good. And I hope that will be part of the conversations going forward. I know you have an incredible amount of work, and you approach that with all good intentions, but the mindset of treating public education as a public good and not as a commodity that can be traded or used as people would see fit for other purposes, because I do see the heart of our state and of our democracy as the cornerstone to that work. So thank you for hearing my comments, and I wish you well in your work.
Thank you, Chris. Is there anyone else in the room? Yep, Chelsea.
Chelsea Myers, Executive Director of the Vermont Superintendent Association. I sent an update to superintendents last week about some of the federal situation and how it might impact Vermont budgets, and thought I would just read it quickly in case it's helpful to you all. There are many unknowns related to the transition happening at the federal level. With that being said, one of the most immediate issues impacting Vermont is finalizing the FY 2023 funding for the U.S. Department of Education, which will impact appropriations for the 25-26 school year. Congress pushed decisions to December 20, and with the incoming administration, Speaker Mike Johnson has indicated a preference to negotiate with the new administration in office. This will make negotiations after Thanksgiving break pretty challenging. Proposed funding levels are deeply divided, with the Senate favoring $12 billion more for education programs than the House. The House proposes to eliminate Title II and Title III and reduce Title I spending by 25%. Under that proposal, federal funding for special education would remain approximately level funded from FY 24, with a $30 million increase. Federal funds account for approximately 10% of total education expenditures in Vermont, primarily through Title and IDEA funding. During fiscal instability, significant decreases in federal funding could have a considerable impact on local budgeting, especially for those districts eligible for the most federal funding, or those with the highest percentages of children from low-income families. The House spending plan would also erode some federal programs in support of English language learners. And so I read that just as a contextual factor that will impact budgeting right now for superintendents and school administrators working on their local budget.
Thank you, Chelsea. There's one more hand on the screen. I will close public comments after that for the first part of the meeting. We'll have another opportunity at the end. So Rob Backlund.
Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Sorry, I'm outside a extremely loud, busy airport, and this is as quiet as I could get, so I really apologize. I appreciate you allowing me to speak. My name's Rob Backlund. I was a former member of the Mount Abraham Unified School District Board, and now I serve on the new formed Lincoln School District Board. Those are just titles. More importantly, close to my heart is I am a stay-at-home dad of a child that will be a member of the class of 2037, that is, and a son that will be a member of the class of 2042. So I think short and long term all the time about school and education in the state of Vermont. Looking at the current commission's draft report, I have questions, but I have a couple concerns regarding this idea of establishing optimal school size, and then what I see is just an Act 46 2.0, the recommendation of closing small schools and small districts. In regards to things that Nancy Cornell said and Jeannie Albert said, I just ask, we can look at data regarding Act 46. I hope we do, and just ask, has equity improved for our students? Have outcomes improved for our students in places where schools have been closed and districts have been merged? I don't have those answers. I think when I've listened to what the commission has said and what the state has said around equity, equity is not the same as uniformity. Equity is not equal. And I know the commission has sort of said that up front with some of their definitions. But what I think when I see my son and my daughter and their classmates is that equity knows no Goldilocks. It's not achieved by trickle down, top down mandates, policies, statutes. It can't be. Equity is a bottom up proposition. It's when our teachers and their support staff know their individual learners, know their successes, know their challenges, meet them day in, day out, whether it's in a large school or a small school. Equity is achieved when we support our students, knowing that they are all different learners. They're all different people, and that's on a day-to-day basis. And so this idea of creating an optimal school size where one school might be too big, are we going to break that school apart? And one school might be too small. Are we going to close that school because we think equity is found in the right temperature porridge? It's not. And I'm just really saddened to see this same 20th century boardroom thinking that closing our small schools in our small towns because we're trying to find some optimal size district or optimal size school is going to improve equity. It just doesn't seem to me that it is. If the data shows differently, then maybe I'll change my tune. But when I see my daughter and son every morning and I drop them off either at school or at their daycare, I just feel that equity is when they get to meet their principal in the morning or their care provider, and those people know their story. And so I appreciate all the work you're doing. I hope you change your course and change your tune around those regards, or provide the data that supports those recommendations. Thank you all very much for all your work.
Thank you, Rob. That closes the first portion of public comment. I do just want to issue a clarifier, mostly because some folks on the screen don't stay for the entire meeting. But I just want to be really clear. The draft report is A, a draft, and B, this commission has not adopted the contents of that draft yet. It is operating right now And again, this commission today will approve the content or not. But at the moment, the draft that's in the agenda materials has all of the brainstormed ideas. It does not represent recommendations. And so there have been a few comments just in general about concern about recommendations. And at this point, the commission, and again, today is the day that they will weigh in on this, but the commission is operating on the surface, the issues, because we do not believe that we have done the research and the data review to make recommendations. And I don't know that that is clear for everyone. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there. So A, in the interest of transparency, what is in the agenda materials is a draft that commission members saw so that they could bring their input to this meeting. So I just wanted to make that clear. So we're gonna keep moving. I guess our next agenda item is subcommittee reports. We agreed to have that be a standing agenda item. I'll start with the steering group. Does the steering group have any updates for the full commission? Summary for folks, the steering group met to affirm the agenda for today. So that's the executive summary. At the finance subcommittee, does a member of the finance subcommittee want to give a quick summary?
We've spent the last 3 meetings going through the brainstorm document and having discussions. But, we also saw some data presented by the Agency of Education and had some information provided to us about foundation formula and how they are used and implemented in other states. Did I miss anything?
No, I think your point and Nicole's point about the chart we have in the back, one of our goals was to create a chart that has all ideas, not necessarily weighing in on the pros and cons of them, but the feeling, especially from our chair, Representative Kornheiser, was it was good to have a chart listing everything, because there's going to be a lot of discussions in this legislative session, and it would be good to have some kind of brief summary for the report. So that was the genesis of that idea.
Thanks. Communication and engagement. I can speak with the committee, but you can weigh in. Committee did meet to review proposals for our communication and engagement consultant. Have brought a recommendation that this group will consider today as part of our agenda. All right. I'm going to turn it over to Zoe. Our intention was to, Zoe gave a really helpful overview of kind of the data request, the status of the data requests so far to the finance subcommittee. And looks like she has it up on the screen.
I compiled a few slides just to walk through the update since we last met in November. So I'll provide a very quick process update on the response to the data request that we received from the commission, along with an overview of the status update and orienting you to a new tool that we'll be using on a regular basis to reflect new inquiries and the agency's response to those questions. I also want to highlight some of the recent data from AOE reports that were published in November. This November, we published the re-released State Education Profile Report and also the Vermont's education funding system explained and compared to other states. We have, over the last few weeks, provided some additional analysis to the Education and Finance Subcommittee, and I'll provide some key highlights from those data presentations. The Agency of Education has received a lot of requests for data, and as I shared at our last meeting, we've been in a very robust and thorough process of data validation. And in fact, our agency's Listen and Learn tour was really designed in part to improve data accessibility and to engage the field deeply in a very thorough data validation process. I did submit a memo to the commission on November 22nd that outlined a couple key areas, including the role of the Agency of Education, the shift to a data-driven culture and what is involved in that. We did respond to some specific data questions and also provided a status of the data response. In terms of the role of the agency, we are the only statewide organization that's responsible for implementing state and federal education laws. And as it relates to our role on the commission, we are responsible for providing the commission with data and information to inform the policy recommendations. The agency proactively contracted with a consultant, ABA consultant, back in July, and that was to support us with our Listen and Learn tour. And part of that, as I mentioned earlier, was designed to improve our data capabilities. We recognized very early on that there was going to be a need for enhanced and more sophisticated reporting beyond what we had produced previously. We also, the commission has, I know today, will be looking at bringing on a consultant for communications. The commission declined to bring on an education finance expert. So the Agency of Education in September did contract with New Solutions K-12 to provide that additional resource in giving us those recommendations, and they've been involved in many of our subsequent education finance subcommittee meetings. In terms of shifting to a data-driven culture, we talked about this last time. Part of that involves addressing long-standing issues with our data infrastructure that includes data collection, includes inconsistency with coding from one supervisor union to the next over time, and also overall just disparate. So we have a number of different data collections, and this is really one of the first times that we've pulled together these disparate data collections in this way to provide a very nuanced and full understanding of our education system. And so anytime that happens, you learn a lot when you're matching up those different data sets. We also, as part of the Listen and Learn tour, before we had the public engagement sessions, we had regional planning with education leaders. So 250 education leaders were part of that, and we traveled all across the state. We brought some additional data to those planning meetings, which is at another layer down. We could validate that and make sure that we had that accuracy. That was a really important part of this process, and recognizing where there were issues where we had to make some corrections, and also gave us insight into how we might need to frame the analyses differently or provide additional contextual understanding to support data-driven decision-making. So just want to call out that the shift to a data-driven culture takes a little bit of time, and we're working on that, but we're really very appreciative of everyone who's been involved. We've worked really closely over the last 3 months with superintendents and business managers and principals to really dive into the data, and have been very committed to making changes where they're needed, because the point is to make sure we're getting it right, and that really is a collaborative effort. So I just want to commend everyone and express my appreciation for those who have been really very deeply involved in this work over the last 3 months. So we had some specific data questions that we also addressed in that memo. We had some questions around why we're using different student counts. And so that's some of what we've provided some further explanation in the state profile report to help understand when and why we would use different student counts. And at the base of it goes to the core of the work of this commission. We're charged to really address the full complexity of our education challenges, and that will require us to look at things in a new way. Sometimes if we continue to stick to how we've always done reporting and how we've always looked at anything, we might not get the insights that we need to really move the work forward. So in our memo, we explained the reason we use different student counts and where, and hopefully in the re-release of the state profile report, there was better understanding and clarity around that. We also, in the re-release, we did make some data corrections. So we had identified that there were some errors with the expenditure analysis as first reported. There was a misalignment between the sending and the chosen student counts. That has been corrected and was corrected right away in terms of being reported in our Listen and Learn tour and everything that was provided to the Education Finance Subcommittee. And now all of that has actually been further expanded and included in the re-release of our state profile report, which I will share. There were some questions around the long-term weighted ADM, and just wanted to make sure that the commission understood the challenges in being able to recreate that analysis in prior years. So the long-term weighted ADM is based on the new weights from Act 127, and it's very challenging for us to recreate that because we didn't collect data this way. We weren't collecting the Medicaid direct cert as part of the budgeting process. And so because of that, there are limitations in being able to look before. However, we're currently in that year for fiscal year 25, and we'll be able to do some analysis related to spending, but the actuals won't be available until next year, as you would imagine. We also had some questions around the source of funding. So as I'll walk through in the re-release of the profile, we actually broke out expenditures into 3 different categories. So looking at total expenditures, so all in money, all sources of dollars for the schools. We looked at operating expenditures, which removed those expenses that weren't part of, that were outside of the year-to-year spending like debt service and things of that nature. And we're able to further isolate expenditures just based on the education fund. The one thing I think is important for us is we think about why would we look at expenditures in this way. When you look at total expenditures, it's really important because we're trying to understand the overall equity and the overall amount of money that are available for our students. But it's also important for this commission to take a view of the taxpayer. And so that's why in future reporting, we've actually been able to further segment that and look at spending just from the education fund, which is more closely, of course, is sourced from the state funding. So I'll walk through a little bit more detail around that. But I wanted the commission to have that broader view because I think all of those, the type of expenditures are all really important, but they inform a different understanding, and they likely will inform different policy actions as we move forward. In the memo, I also shared the status of the data responses, and I'll preview that in the next slide. We did put together a very simple tool that I know has been included in the draft report. This is intended to be a point-in-time overview of the data requests that we've received and also those responses. We've noted in that tool the specific resources that are currently available and also identifies an additional analysis that we are working towards as we continue with our reporting. So the highlights, as we look at the status update, we received 34 discrete data requests. Those requests are related to budget analysis, cost drivers, the use of the education fund, and student outcomes. We, as an agency, have delivered on the vast majority of the data requests. There are a few exceptions for items that the Education Finance Subcommittee is refining or they deemed are not necessary at this time. And that's part of the work too, is we need to prioritize the analysis and make sure that we are maximizing our time. There's a couple additional data collections that we are looking to do related to class size. So while we do capture some data around class size, we recognize the need to do a broader data validation with the field to make sure that that's being reported accurately, because there's some different ways that that information has been collected and presented across supervisory districts. So that is something that we are working towards. Additionally, we will release future topical reports. We have prioritized the next few. We'll focus on special education delivery, pre-kindergarten, and college and career readiness as the next topical reports that we'll be releasing. As I mentioned, we re-released the state education profile. So this report was first released in August and actually was kind of the kickoff as we all got together as a commission. We walked through some of the high level data from that report. We've spent a lot of time in the field, as I mentioned, doing data validation and digging deeper. So the re-released report includes a new section that provides a more detailed overview of the Vermont education system. Vermont is really unique in how we deliver education, and so we felt it was really needed to provide a more robust understanding around that. We also updated the enrollment figures. Those have been updated across all years. And also we separated out CTE, career and technical education, and dual enrollment from those enrollment figures. In the report, we've included some new maps as well. So you'll be able to see the distribution of students in a lot of different ways. And we can look at that if that would be useful for the conversation later today. Demographics. So we did make some updates to the special education percentages and the supervisory union school district comparison by need. So we did see some shifts there. In terms of overall performance, when we think about student outcomes, the updated report includes the preliminary 2024 Vermont CAP results. With respect to staffing, this version of the report focuses through 2022-23. And we did exclude pre-K and CTE from the analysis. I know I'm getting a little weedy, but I think these are some specific questions for the commission that I wanted to make sure you saw are reflected in them. In terms of expenditures, the new report has a more detailed analysis. As I mentioned earlier, it looks at total expenditures, all sources of funding, operating expenditures, and just the education fund. And the appendices are very robust, and this is a new practice that we've implemented. With every data report, we're also including what's called recipe cards. And those recipe cards spell out the specific steps that were involved in creating that analysis, and that's accompanied by an open source data set. So that can be very supportive for those that are interested in recreating the analysis. In terms of the overall results, the re-release report presents a consistent data story when you think about the overall statewide trends. Vermont schools tend to be smaller and more highly staffed. We have experienced a significant enrollment decline over the past 20 years, and a lot of that decline occurred before the pandemic. We do see persistent achievement gaps for economically disadvantaged, English learner, and special education groups. And we saw really interesting differences based on size and need of the supervisory units of school districts across the state. So smaller supervisory units of districts tend to serve higher need students, and they tend to pay teachers less due to many budget constraints. So those are some patterns that we saw. As you would expect, when we dig deeper into the data, we're able to uncover some additional insights, and we certainly did as we look at this updated report. We actually saw a steeper enrollment decline than previously reported. So that's looking back from 2003 to 2004 to 2022 to 23. And so the decline has been a 21.5% decline in student enrollment.
Quick clarifying question. When you say size, does that reference the enrollment size or geographic size?
Enrollment. And then, so as we did this work at a detailed level at the supervisory unit, supervisor district level, you would imagine there are some shifts in terms of grouping. And so that's also included within the appendix so that there's clarity around how the supervisory units of districts are organized within the analysis throughout the report. As I mentioned, we dove a lot deeper into the expenditures. And I think one thing that, peeling back the onion was quite interesting in looking at that data. And I know the Education and Finance Subcommittee has some additional insights that we can, I'm sure, we'll discuss. But when we looked only at expenditures from the education fund, we didn't see any, that there was any meaningfully higher spending in higher need communities. And so, of course, it is important to recognize that that analysis precedes the Act 127 weights. But it's interesting for us to consider as we're thinking about some of the broader national context. So just to repeat, so when we think about the education funding expenditures, they're not meaningfully higher in higher need communities, which means that we tend to rely on the federal, have tended to rely on the federal dollars to be able to have more equitable distribution of funds. So as we move forward, and there may be the potential of a reduction in federal dollars, this is something that we're going to need to be very mindful of as a state to ensure that when we need equity, we're able to fund that in a way that provides additional resources to those students that we know need additional resources and cost more to educate. So the second report that we released since we last met was the education funding report. It was organized into 3 sections. The first was really just to explain our very complicated education funding system. And this was organized as a question and answer section and really responded to a lot of the common questions we have received through the Listen and Learn tour, and also that we have heard here as a commission through public comments. The second part of the report compares Vermont's education funding system to other states and looked at specific areas of the actual funding amount, the budget timeline, governance, and educational best practices. The report concluded with some future considerations. These in no way are foregone conclusions, but just simply identifying potential paths forward based on the analysis. I want to just highlight a couple of key areas of how Vermont compares to other states. First, we have a reverse approach to other states, and that creates a lot of unique challenges for us when we think about having transparency and predictability with our overall budget cycle. So what do I mean by we have a reverse approach to other states? In most states, they say, this is the amount of money that each district has to spend. And that is communicated very early on in the cycle and gives a clear understanding around the budget available. Within our system, we actually, the districts are able to determine the amount of money that they need to educate each student, and then they share that with the state, which that's funded through the education fund. So it's the reverse of any other system. Within our system, we have a lot of what we call local independence, but less control on the impact of taxpayers. And so as you'll dive into the report, it really is able to clearly explain how we pool our resources, which is really designed to be equitable, but create some complexity in that. And even districts that may reduce their budgets or have flat spending, they still may see an increase in their taxes, right? Just because of how our system is designed. So that is outlined a little bit more in our report. Overall, Vermont has significantly more and bigger school boards. We have limited benchmarks and comparative analysis. And so in a lot of other states, they're able to set very clear goals and best practices that are based on performance within the state and also compared to other states that can be helpful in terms of creating a shared alignment of goals. Vermont has very small class sizes, and as we were looking at this, it's small, not necessarily because of a small school, but small because of deliberate decisions around the intent to keep class sizes small. Overall, we have many teachers, but at a lower pay. There tend to be fewer specialized teachers in the Vermont education system and a reliance on paraprofessionals. There is a tendency to favor full-time staff, and so even if you're a small school, tend to staff as if you're a large school. And so those are some things to think about. And again, these are common themes. It doesn't mean that every school operates this way. The role of tuitioning is very unique in Vermont, and there's a section of the report that speaks to that. So it's tuitioning to an independent school and also tuitioning to another public school. We are going to provide a deeper overview of tuitioning in the future because we know that there are still some questions around how that works. I also think it's helpful to see a visual representation of our tuitioning pattern so we can see that interdependence as well. I know that there has been a question that we've received around tuitioning, and there's one data point that looks at tuitioning to out-of-state schools. It's 1% of all students are tuitioned, not 1% of all Vermont students. So just want to make sure that that's clear. And there was a subsequent report to that effect of the state board recently. We also talked about the statewide education programs that are coming what we call off the top of the education fund. And then the overall budgeting process and timeline is very different than other states for a lot of reasons that I've shared earlier. Our budgeting cycle starts earlier and ends earlier, which creates challenges because you don't have all the input that you may need to be strategic with budgeting decisions that early on in the cycle. So future considerations looked at a couple of key areas. So related to funding, considering revising the statewide education funding formula with respect to structure, exploring ways to organize and structure districts to promote more equitable learning opportunities, and staffing, looking to align personnel with the student enrollment needs. And this is not just around budget challenges, but around some of the workforce shortages that we're experiencing as well, are really creating some need to be creative with staffing. Our consultant New Solutions K-12 is actually doing a series in December around some tips as you think about budgeting strategically. The educational series was developed with input from our Vermont School Boards Association, Vermont Principals Association, Vermont Superintendents Association, and also based on input we've just been receiving, right? And one thing I want to clarify is we know we can't train our way, right? I think that was what Jay mentioned. We can't train our way out of the challenges, but there are some hopefully support that is offered through that, and some consistency as we all are trying to really navigate those tough challenges and considerations. So in addition to those reports that were released in November, we provided the additional analysis to the Education Finance Subcommittee We had a deeper dive into the education fund expenditure analysis and looking at it by object and function, which is another layer down than what's included in the re-released report. We also looked at school size as well. And so I think it's about 20% of our schools are under 100 students. So it's just something to have as a reference point as we think about our current ecosystem. So I've walked through some of the updates in the re-released state education profile report. We walked through that with the subcommittee, and I know the subcommittee didn't have a chance yet to really dig into it, but I expect that there'll be some additional questions through their analysis that we'll address at our upcoming meeting. And we are certainly excited to get that input and to respond to that. Additionally, our consultant APA provided a presentation to the education finance system around the fundamentals of a foundation formula. And that presentation really talks about what it is and what it isn't, right? And the different ways that states go about creating a foundation formula. It's important to note that there's a lot of complexity to developing a foundation formula, and there's a lot that goes into that, and there are assumptions that are built in around education quality and scale. There's a lot of considerations that are going to be important should we go down that path, but I thought it was a really helpful framing for that conversation as we move forward. So those are my updates.
Thank you, Zoe. Questions? Yeah. Peter.
Does the state education profile report get into facility needs at all, or is that separate?
It is not in that report, but we do have a report around the facility needs, and we'll be publishing a dashboard soon. That will have additional.
Actually, yeah. Where's the dashboard?
Yes, the dashboard is coming. The other question that the subcommittee has is how do we start to combine all of this analysis? And that is something we noted at the last education finance subcommittee meeting, and we think would be really important as we think about prioritizing investments, right, in those facilities that have the biggest potential to serve students well.
You know, we've been charged with talking to the Vermont Youth Council later, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. I was very excited to receive an email requesting that students were going to be part of your listen. Would you mind talking about that?
Absolutely. So as I've shared with our listen and learn tour, we did initial data analysis, then we did our regional planning with education leaders, and then we posted public engagement sessions. We've added 2 more public engagement sessions for Windham County and Chittenden County, which are happening this week. And what we noticed as we were going through the sessions is we didn't have a lot of student participation, and we were hopeful that we would, and it just didn't pan out. So in response, we partnered with Up for Learning, and they are hosting focus groups with our students. So we're really looking forward to getting feedback from students through this process. And I want to thank the Vermont Principal Association too for the trustees really helping us think through how to do that well. And appreciate the partnership with the superintendents as well in making that happen. So very delighted to be able to bring in that.
Thank you for doing that.
I just want to thank you and the agency for being proactive in the first place, but also responsive as quickly as you have been to the enormous requests for data. Realizing that every report is kind of the tip of the iceberg that is the culmination of a lot of deep diving. So I know it's a lot of work, and I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I'm sure the team will really appreciate it. I'm really proud of the agency and all the work that's gone into this. We've really been able to build upon the talent and the expertise that we have in the agency, and there's a lot of excitement and the ability to really work cross-functionally in this way to support the field with new reporting. So it definitely has been a collaborative effort, as it should be. And I really appreciate the cooperation and partnership.
What I think the strongest for us is that, and I don't mean just the people sitting in this room, but Vermont generally, is we can identify that there are issues, but it's unclear how to fix it. And I think having that data is going to be critical to the work that flows from it. So I'm glad that it's happening because I think it will, hopefully surface some ideas that I think, we can get around as far as how to fix things.
It always does feel like the tip of the iceberg, but we're getting there.
Any other thoughts, questions?
I'll just say real quick on comments that we talked about, not being able to train our way out of this. but just the acknowledgement that we think that school boards and superintendents and principals, and business managers are all doing the best they can in the circumstances they have. So, I think the things that you folks are offering is fantastic. You've been very responsive. I know I'm one of the ones yelling from the hills and have been for years. So I do want you to know that I appreciate that. And that the agency is-
And one other thing, I think we did talk at the last meeting about Brigham, sort of on the heels of the foundation formula presentation. We had a conversation around Brigham. If we overturned a foundation formula, we can't have foundation formulas in Vermont, right? And so I think it helped us understand that it all depends, right? That the foundation formulas, we need a different kind of name, but have evolved substantially in the 30 years since Brigham, and so almost 30. So I think it's just really important to have that kind of dialogue and back and forth. So I appreciated you bringing in some folks with that expertise, but also having made available the general counsel for the agency to sort of help us talk through some of the, number one, acknowledge we have to do all this within a Brigham framework.
Correct.
And the devil's in the details. So thank you for making that connection. That was important.
I had a question regarding data around independent schools. I think this came up in one of the finance committee meetings about one of the data reports, and you mentioned that it was specific to public schools, right? School size and class size and those things. I just wonder whether that's a question for the finance committee or for the steering committee or us as a whole, that we can also request that similar data around independent schools. I think that's important as we look at the entire education ecosystem, what public dollars are going to approve independent schools, so that, we're really fully understanding. I mean, I think we have 80 plus approved independent schools in the state. I think it's important for us to know what that data looks like in terms of the size of those schools and similar operating procedures to what we have for public schools.
Well, we're in the process of thinking through the data validation for class size specifically. So that's, we don't
Do you
have
have
that
that
level
information?
of detail we need right now for public schools.
I was going to ask, do we have that information for private schools? Number of kids in a class for the some of the small private schools? Do we even
I
collect
haven't
that data?
checked. I haven't
So I
reported.
don't know if I've ever even seen that data. I agree with your point. We know it just, I was looking at just
Spending public dollars on it,
education
you should know.
directory. We have independent schools of 1, we have independent schools of, 500 and 600. And so there's a lot of variability. And as we start to talk about small schools, we shouldn't eliminate the conversation about small independent schools and where public dollars are going to support those institutions.
I'd have to look. I'm not sure what we have on.
But I just, maybe that comes up in the further work of the finance committee or the steering committee. I'm not saying that that's been a request that you haven't fulfilled. It's just, I think it's in the context of that larger request around school size and operating structures and all of those things, that we're also including that data around independent schools.
I know we had some conversation with Jill Briggs Campbell about some of that information, and I had a couple of questions for you, but you really answered them. But one of my questions to John's point is that, are we going to be able to take a look? I think it would be helpful to take a look at a map, and take a look at some of those data points in the map. What are the size of schools? Where are they located in the state? Could we take a list of look at a list of spending per ADM and how that maps out?
Right.
Just some of those pieces. You mentioned a little bit about that in teacher salary, and so I assume that's coming as
I'm
well.
looking for a lot of that.
Yes, that would be very helpful.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you kind of addressing that as well.
Yeah. So the re-released report has additional maps, and we're working on some as well as we're prioritizing. But I think it is a really helpful illustration to understand the geographic patterns and the uniqueness of different communities as well.
Well, and we talked about it at the finance committee around, small by necessity or small by choice or by desire or community preference. And I think and even on some of the tuitioning conversations around dollars going out of state, right? Like, we know that in many parts of the state, the only option is a public school across the border in New Hampshire, right? And so in the absence of a tuitioning program, where, so
being able to visualize the choices that we're making as a state and the policy implications of each, I think is going to be really very excited.
So wondering I have, knowing what today's date is, I think it sounds like a lot of things that we're talking about are really important conversations for the next year.
Jay, you stole my segue.
I was trying to set you up.
Thank you. That is exactly what I was going to move us to the conversation. Even just this past few minutes, and I should back up and echo folks' thanks to the agency for a significant amount of very responsive data collection. There is no such thing as perfect data. We all learn how to look at data as part of our, hopefully, K-12 education, but also, right? So that is what we are doing, is looking at all of the data and analyzing it, figuring out what's missing and where else we need to go. But just this short conversation is indicative of how complex it is to do that well. And this current draft was developed based on the operating assumption that we will not be able to do that level of analysis by the time this initial report is due. And because of that, this report makes some recommendations, but not about policy. And so the goal of today's conversation, first I'll do just a little bit of recap around our conversations to date. And then we need to have discussion about the substance of each section of the report. But I want to remind us that this commission made a commitment to being very data-driven before it said anything is a good idea or bad idea. And that we have moved actually quite quickly, given that update on receiving data, but that is still not quickly enough to be able to turn this around. In November, we talked about how knowing that that is true, but also needing to deliver to the legislature the report that they have asked us to do, that it made the most sense. Our operating assumption at the moment, and again, that's what this is a report of the commission, so the commission needs to ultimately make this decision. But the draft was created with the operating assumption that at this stage, the best thing that this commission can do is provide as much information as possible to the General Assembly, knowing that we need to pick up our work very quickly to do the deeper dive that everyone is talking about. So with that, I'll do a quick run through of what is in the report, and then I'm going to propose that we go section by section. Some will be quick, some will not. And in fact, I can tell you that most of the substantive feedback is about the policy recommendation chart, and I don't think that's going to be a surprise to anyone. So we'll spend most of our time there. But just kind of a reminder, and for folks on the screen, this group received an early draft shortly after our November meeting. A revised draft went out just before break. That is what is in the agenda packet today. Thanks to those of you who sent edits. There are probably many grammatical edits to be had. Those will be integrated separately. We won't spend time today wordsmithing. But what we will spend time today is on the substance of it. So the report is organized based on some background information, the policy context, essentially. This commission agreed that that's one of the most important things this report can do, is talk about the policy context, and then potential policy actions and recommendations. So my suggestion is that we take these section by section and surface the discussion here. And my goal is to try to keep the discussion moving forward and get us to a place where we know what we will be submitting. The report the report will hit the press on December 13th because the 15th is a Sunday. And the steering group does have one more meeting on the 11th of December, just so that they can put one last set of eyes. But the substantive action on the content will happen today. Okay, so I'm going to start with what I anticipate being the easiest part. So the first section that I would like just the group to either affirm that we're moving forward or not is just the background. And I see that as kind of the, page 1 to the top of page 5, which is really the law, our membership, our work plan, and our guiding principles. And that second draft did have a clarification that Jennifer brought up. I think it was you, Jennifer. And if not, it was a good idea anyway, and I just gave you credit for it. We wanted to be clear that the 3 policy areas were a way that we as a commission decided to do our work. There's actually many more policy areas that we're required to report on. So that is one big change. Thank you. Comments, questions about that part?
About the background?
Just the background.
I did have some comments, and it's on page 5, for example, current Vermont context. School spending decisions in Vermont are defined largely at the local level. I added that it's also affected by Montpelier and DC. There are decisions, and we have talked about that. We've had public comments over the course of our tenure from people who talk about things coming from Montpelier and DC that do affect local education spending. So I thought it was important to include some of the comments we received. So I just added, but how much is spent locally is also affected by decisions made in Montpelier and in Washington, DC.
You mean like unfunded mandates?
It could be funded or unfunded, correct.
So, yeah, I was gonna say, Megan, are we in the right place?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Oh,
That's the next section.
you said 1 through 5.
Top of the page, very, very, very top of the page, of page 5.
Got it.
Really, as soon as preliminary findings is where
Got
you're
it.
going next. Thank you. I'm really bad at looking at the screen. Craig, go ahead.
Mine's just a side note, and I'm not trying to derail us, but I know folks were interested. So the December 1 letter did just come out. So I'm happy to talk about that whenever makes sense for the flow.
Group, what would you like?
Can it be forwarded to commission members? Can we get it right now?
Craig, can you forward it to commission members? Maybe we will take a break in a few minutes.
Can I forward it to Maureen or Suzanne, who can forward it along?
Thank you.
Sure.
So the question on the floor right now is up to a call to action.
Right before, no, it's just to the bottom of guiding principles.
The preliminary findings is just on the heading is just on the bottom
Correct.
of page 4. So we're on page 4, guiding principles.
1 through 4, I think, right?
Pages 1 through 4. And
Okay.
I'll be back
Got
on
it.
pages 1 through
Are
4.
you looking for a motion or
Right.
I mean, I would almost just look for a straw poll to keep going and have a big motion at the end is my recommendation. So this is more straw poll. I guess it would be raise a concern that you have with this part, John. Go
I
ahead.
just want to make sure I'm including
Yep.
sections. So is the call to action, is that something we're looking at now? Is that part of that?
That's
No,
next.
That's next.
Yes.
Okay, I just
Yep.
didn't want to miss that.
Yep. Nope.
Thank you.
Down through the bottom of our guiding principles.
So that my comments were about that then.
Nope, yours are in the current Vermont context, which is right below that.
Okay.
So for me, Jeff, the current Vermont context is at the beginning of page 5.
Yeah, we print
We're talking about
I think so, too.
page 4.
Essentially, this first part is what was the law? How did we organize our work? Who we are? And what we agreed as our guiding principles. Okay. All right. I'm not seeing any significant. So preliminary findings. This is the section essentially up through the status of the data requests, I believe. Yes.
Can we just go subsection by subsection?
Let's do that.
Vermont.
Current Vermont context. So this is where there've been, so I heard a desire to also reference that part of our context is federal
Specifically, in fact,
decisions made, yeah.
the 4th paragraph under current Vermont context, starting with school spending decisions in Vermont, are defined largely at the local level, and I suggest adding but how much is spent locally also is affected by decisions made in Montpelier and in Washington, D.C.
I would piggyback this, and I emailed Megan this comment, but I'll just share it with the full commission. I had a similar comment where, you know, to your point about the unfunded mandates, my experience has been that a lot of times, by the time we have costs related to universal meals, social services, mental health services, health insurance, retirement, it doesn't feel from a local perspective like there are a lot of levers to pull. And so this also jumped out at me because I think a lot of supervisory union, supervisory districts would say they don't feel like they have a lot of local control over their expenses and that they have very few levers in order to be able to pass a budget.
It makes me wonder if, just given the conversation too that we just had, is delivery models are largely defined at the local level, but spending is impacted by a lot of things that are not necessarily driven by decisions. Mm-hmm.
Health insurance negotiation,
Yeah.
for example.
It's helpful.
So are we suggesting that we strike out the sentence completely, or that we add something to it?
Well, I mean, I'll just zoom out. There's a difference between wordsmithing because we think it can be said better and wordsmithing because we are saying something that the commission doesn't mean. So that's how I would separate those two things. That's all. That was like a header to your question. I would pose your question to the group.
Well, I think to Zoe's point about we do things in the inverse,
Yeah.
Vermont, I do think it's important to name that school budgets are defined at the local level. Those budgets reflect a combination of locally, local needs, state and federal requirements, something like that. But we do need to acknowledge that ultimate responsibility for budgeting rests with both the school boards.
Folks comfortable with that?
I think so. I don't know what the wording is, but I think in concept, I think we've agreed in some level.
Yeah, goal, I think, is conceptual agreement. The steering group, I think we're gonna have to defer final wordsmithing to make sure it represents that.
Just from a process standpoint, I would think that the sort of final version of the report would be submitted to the full commission prior to the steering group meeting, so that if we get feedback, like the way you guys missed the mark, we have that.
Yep.
Had that conversation.
Well, I also think 2 paragraphs above, you get it, or the gist of our conversation here, that the issue of cost is not just one of the local district spending. So there's some way to incorporate that.
Other comments? Yeah, Oliver.
Yeah, in the first paragraph, there's a statement that there were significant reductions made in spending in many school districts. I feel like that should be supported with some data. It's the very first paragraph. Very first sentence, actually.
I think a source of data could be the December 1 letter from last year versus approved budget totals, because those were projections that business managers give to the agency early in the process, and then the process plays itself out and boards make decisions either in response to a failed budget or so you see what the delta is between what was projected and what actually came in. That's something
I'm not sure, because it's the way it's worded, it implies that there are a lot of school boards that made year-over-year cuts to their budgets, and I'm not sure that that's
The data we
Yeah.
reported from the agency was that some of the districts that struggled the most to pass their budgets were also the lowest spending and the highest. So we did see that.
Kind of gets to what Oliver's saying and what I
Yeah.
think, right?
Well, I actually think, no, I think differently. Sorry, Jay. I think the question I think for the commission is, the purpose of this statement is really about the increases in property taxes. After budget failures, school budgets were reduced. That is what this sentence is meant to say. And I think it would be pretty easy to pull that data. I'm going to tell you, I don't have time to chase it, but that's what it's meant to
It's some wordsmithing, because the way I read it was that across the state, there were school budgets that were at a year-over-year decline, and I don't think that's.
Yeah, no, I think it's meant to say that when budgets failed, school districts
Yes.
went back to the
Okay,
table
so
and cut.
I think that's a word, yeah.
And even then did not see a corresponding reduction.
But still,
Yes.
yeah, I do think that's an
Yeah.
important distinction.
Yes. Okay.
The other comment I had there is there's a statement that refers to population decline. And that's not correct. Vermont's population is actually not in decline. It's the student population that's in decline, which I think is really important. It's a demographic challenge that we have as a state. And closely related to that, there's an issue with birth rate nationwide. I mean, these issues we're not going to magically have a bunch of students show up in the next 10 years. It's just not going to happen.
So that's enrollment decline.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else around current Vermont context?
Sorry, one more. There's a sentence where it says we must acknowledge the impact of these issues on Vermont's public schools. I would suggest just changing at the end Vermont's education system.
Trying to also look the screen. Commission members on the screen, if you have your hand up and I'm not calling you, just start talking. Okay. Are we ready to move on to the call to action section?
Sorry, one more.
Yep.
So healthcare has been cited as a huge driver of costs, and there's some very significant data that we've seen in the independent school community as it relates to VHI. And I think it's a really important finding. Just over the last few years, a significant number of independent schools that were part of VHI have left or are in the process of leaving, and they all reported a net reduction in healthcare expenditures.
Do those schools have to negotiate with their employees what the benefits, what the plan covers?
Some-
I think that is part of, it's what's the plan designed?
Yeah, exactly. But these are this is a big cost driver, and I think that's a pretty significant finding.
I'm just not sure how relevant it is to the context of public schools who, number one, we're in the statewide process. Not seeing it, it's hard for me to say, yeah, we need to incorporate into this report, but
Well,
it's something we should discuss or look at.
Yeah.
the purpose of this is to set the context that healthcare is a cost driver, which this does. In the chart actually is renegotiate a statewide healthcare, and it's there twice. So I think,
So we can come back to it.
yeah, I think it is in here, maybe not quite so explicitly, but is that okay? Okay, so call to action. This is the piece where we just sort of acknowledged our timeline requires school district decision-making right now, because that is what's, by the time this report goes out, even right now, today, most budgets are pretty well through the process.
I have some thoughts to
Yep.
share with that. And first off, I just want to say I appreciate the statement that says for years, the affordability challenges described above have been understood as problems that public education school boards, administrators, and teachers are responsible for causing and therefore are responsible for fixing. This narrative must change. I also personally feel very strongly that we should include something to the effect of, similarly, Vermont's small rural schools are often to blame for our inefficiency and high cost of education. Given that small schools make up the vast majority of our schools, this narrative must also change. I do worry that there are a number of points in the overall report that perpetuate this narrative around rural schools being deficit, rural schools being the problem. And I worry that if we don't make it clear that we support our rural schools, that becomes the low-hanging fruit that people perceive needs to go. And so I know that's a big ask. I appreciate what is there, but I also feel that we need to be clear that we understand the lack of economy of scale that exists in our state. We recognize that. But I also worry about somehow perpetuating this narrative that rural schools are the problem, that rural schools are what needs to change. Yes, there are some schools that may not be sustainable, but I worry about us setting us up for a sort of a massive public relations issue for all of our school communities, supervisory unions, supervisory districts, when it comes to small schools, if we don't acknowledge the importance that they exist in our ecosystem.
Commission members, that it would essentially be fleshing out that statement to speak specifically to Vermont's rurality.
And I understand, I think Megan sent out today a long diatribe that I provided for you, and there was a much longer statement there, and I certainly understand that that would be a lot to ask to include all these major points. But I do think somehow acknowledging that, when we're thinking about the blame, I really don't want to make sure that this commission somehow is perpetuating this idea that small schools are the blame.
I think that's fair, I have to say, because we're not making recommendations yet. We're sort of putting everything out there, and I wouldn't want it to sound like, we are already prejudging the conclusion when we haven't even had a chance to collect and analyze the data as a group. That's fine for me.
I'm going to, despite being from a rural area, respectfully disagree that we start sort of subcategorizing under this statement. Then why don't we also talk about how Chittenden County gets the blame because they have the highest teacher salaries, or, we're going to end up, I think there's, I don't necessarily agree that people say it's rural schools. They might say it's tiny schools. But I think in this statement, I think it is important to keep it broad. And if we start subcategorizing, then the other folks are going to say, well, let's also make clear that independent schools aren't the problem, or that high teacher salaries in South Burlington aren't the problem.
Zoe and then Anne, sorry, and then Oliver.
I also live in a rural community, and I'm not seeing that coming out, but I do, being cognizant of that, in our education funding report with future considerations, we careful to balance kind of this dual need of being able to provide a lot of resources to our students while also recognizing the desire for community elementary schools particularly. So that language is something that the team appreciates, that balance. But I think we're at a point if we start to talk about specific schools, it actually could work against the goal of really just trying to say we need to collectively come together to understand.
I have a wordsmith related thought that I wonder we'll get at it, but first I'm going to go to Anne and then Oliver. Anne, go ahead.
Yeah. Part of what the finance subcommittee has been doing is saying there's no one thing that's to blame, and I don't think anyone's blaming, but the small size of our schools is part of the overall problem. And I don't think we can start leaving out any, agree with Representative Conlon. We could also say high teacher salaries in Chittenden County are the problem, do away with those and would save X millions. I think we just need to acknowledge this is a very complex problem. And not all rural schools are the same. Some are rural by choice. Some are rural because you can't get in and out of them with any alacrity. And so I think we need to keep everything on the table. And if we start just selectively saying, well, you know, we're going to keep that, kind of defeat our purpose.
Thanks, Ann. Oliver?
Largely going
sorry.
to with Peter and Ann, and I, in my comments, I suggested just kind of sort of removing the whole blame issue completely, because I don't think people blame the public education system. I think nobody knows. There's general frustration. Nobody knows who to blame. And then talk to 24 or so legislators, they would say that, you know, they were blamed a month ago. So I think it would be best just to sort of remove any sort of assignment of blame, just generally within this call to action.
Yeah.
Nicole and then Zoe.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, Oliver, but I think I agree with you. I do think there is a collective call that sort of builds up, like, it's no one district's or handful of districts' responsibility to address this issue, nor is it one community or one you know, it is, the call to action is really, we're all in this together. We all have to be willing to think creatively about, I think Chris Young said this, but who we want to be when we grow up. Like, that's what the call is, that we need to be coming to this conversation with an open mind, and so I agree. I think blame is probably not that, but I also think we need to. I would like to see the point made that it's not one group of communities, or like we all play a role. Every decision that gets made in every community across the state adds up to where we are.
Zoe.
I tend to agree with that. I think the call to action can be framed more around collaborating and recognizing the complexity of the issue. I think the conversation we're having now points to the fact that we need to have more clarity around how we're actually defining like districts and like schools, meaning similar, because not all rural schools operate the same way. You know, not all middle schools, not all high schools operate the same way. And we've already heard in public comment that there's different ways people are organizing and categorizing governance models, right? And so I think we need to, in this section, focus on the collaboration and acknowledge the complexity and recognize that we need to do more work to really understand the similarities around how our schools and districts are organized to be able to make those types of recommendations.
Let me say one more wordsmithing thing. This isn't wordsmithing, actually. I just wanted to remind us that this is here because the narrative that this group did want to push back on is this would all be fixed by spending. And then all the different reasons people attach to why we spend too much, some of which is small schools, some of which is tuition, some insert many, many things. So I just wanted to remind us that I'm not sure it says quite the same thing that the commission intended if it doesn't say something altogether, because this was meant to push back on the narrative that this could all be fixed if schools just spent less. So I just wanted to put that in the room. The wordsmithing thought, and then we should keep going, was around keeping this, but adding a context about it's the educational ecosystem, which is the agency's words, that causes this. And that someone else said it's no one community's responsibility to impact it. I think those are useful additions that kind of touch on that. I also kind of agree with, if we start this being a laundry list, we're inevitably going to leave something out, and that's also not helpful. So Jennifer and then Jay.
So I also had flagged for you the idea about blame, and I'm also not comfortable, and I'm not sure that I haven't seen that. I haven't seen in my experience that school board members feel like they're shouldering the blame here. I think the legislature is shouldering a lot of blame. So I would be comfortable with taking out this whole concept of blame. I like the idea of collaboration. And I think it's somewhere earlier, now I don't remember where you put in, there is no magic bullet.
It's later in that paragraph.
Okay,
Mhm.
I think really that's exactly what this is. I mean, there is no magic bullet. We're all in this together. You know, this is a call to action to think creatively and be collaborative. And to the first sentence, you know, the commission wishes to elevate a collective call to action. I would add the General Assembly to that list. Because I think, again, we're working at this from a number of different angles to reach one solution.
Fine for Jay.
Slightly change what I was going to say based on what Jennifer just said. I think the call to action itself should be one solid paragraph. In the words of Mark Twain, why write more than you need to. And I would have the first sentence, maybe adding in the General Assembly, maybe adding in the administration, because they're both big players in this. And then I would go right from that first sentence to the commission recognizes that Vermont. You have all the blame stuff. We're all in this together. We still bring forth the point there's no silver bullet solution, and that all three major policy considerations need to be taken. And there's our call to action. We're all in this together. Everybody's a player in this. We're not blaming anybody. Let's figure it out together. And then right into that second paragraph, which is the meat of what we want to say. Just as a suggestion.
I had a version of that suggestion, which is to strike the sentence that's about the blame. So unfortunately, the blame for, and just eliminate that. But my suggestion would have kept the piece about affordability challenges have been understood as problems that school boards, administrators, teachers, communities have caused. So my suggestion is somewhere halfway in between what you're suggesting too. And the only reason I say that is I think there is a bigger narrative focusing on schools than perhaps you're hearing. I know I get it a lot as, oh, well, you get what I get because I forward it back to you. A lot of the public comment I receive as chair is about schools. So I don't know, I do think that that narrative is there. I also think that if the commission.
If I may, I feel like the whole idea of unfunded mandates, that's what I'm hearing. And so I think for school board members who feel like they're shouldering the blame, I think a lot of them would say like, look, we've been given more responsibility, and the only way for us to do this is to raise our property taxes because there has not been money allocated for, you know, insert what the topic is.
Yeah, I guess I would say it this way. I'd zoom up a level. When we read the newspaper, listen to the media, listen to the radio, and we hear about our high property taxes in Vermont, it is because of the cost of education. That is the narrative.
Well, and when we hear allowable growth,
right?
You know, like you can only spend this, if only we change the funding system and restrict the access to the money you have to spend without addressing all the other pieces.
Right.
That's the message.
Right.
But
do we adequately point to the call to action by Jay's suggestion of eliminating anything about the narrative? I mean, John, you started this off by saying you appreciated that sentence is there, not to put you on the spot.
Well,
Does it have
I
the same
do
weight?
think the intent, when somewhere that came out of some conversations, you know, a month ago or 2 months ago, was that we wanted to acknowledge that the good work that happens in our local school districts shouldn't be perceived as always the blame. I mean, I think but I do appreciate what everybody's discussion is shifting it away from blame and talking about our shared responsibility and our, you know, shared ownership of this. And that is at all levels. That's at the state level, the local level, at every level. And I certainly can support that.
Can we add something to the effect of all of these systems and all these levers that we're talking about are all in service of students? That I don't think anybody thinks for a minute that any school board, the administration, the legislature is spending money unnecessarily. I think they're all designed to meet the needs of students. You know, I think Jay's right. It's if you want to say the three issues that we've identified. But I think there should be some acknowledgement that the system that we're talking about here is serving student needs.
Oliver and then Zoe.
So I do I'll probably be a little contrarian here, but I do think the call to action is a little bit empty. And that this is an interim report. We are in the midst of budgeting season for both public school districts as well as independent schools. The time for action to influence property taxes, education spending generally, and leading on property taxes next year, that window is closing pretty fast. And I think we have an opportunity to put forth a goal, a target, not binding in any way. Obviously, we don't have that authority, but some sort of a goal that everybody can rally around in terms of trying to keep the growth of spending, below a certain target. Something that everybody can look at, whether you're a school board member or independent school, and say, hey, listen, we're going to work collaboratively together to try to stay below this. Well, we have this window, because if we wait until the legislature's in session, it's too late. So I think if there's one thing that we could do that's meaningful in this call to action, I think it's putting some sort of a target on the table and ask, obviously we can't mandate, but suggest that people enforce that.
Nicole.
I'm not prepared to do that. The governor has done that. So the governor did that a month and a half, 2 months ago, with the first letter to school board members and administrators in sort of forecasting what was going to happen, that he was going to be doing a 3% budget increase, is basically 0 or 3%. And the reason I don't support this body doing it is because as a school board, that's what I asked for. 0%, 3%. Our school district is one that has added more capacity because of the weights, because that's what we were supposed to do, is spend those additional resources to support students. And if we were to stay within that 3%, that would be a reduction of 10 teachers or 18 paraprofessionals. So for Winooski to take that guidance, but our friends down the road in South Burlington, we've picked on South Burlington a little bit, I'll keep going, to not have to make those reductions because it's just a suggestion. I have serious concerns about some school boards taking that to heart, making significant adjustments. As Zoe said, the data show that districts that have the hardest time passing their budgets tend to underinvest, that will exacerbate some of the equity issues. And, as someone who's gone through this process of, we're supposed to be spending some additional resources because we have high needs in our community, to then talk about elimination of a dozen or more people, which, may be the right thing to do. I haven't looked at the data. We're going to do more of that. But if my neighboring districts aren't engaged in that same activity because it's just a suggestion, then I think we're furthering the inequitable outcomes that we see in the state. I just don't think we have that. The governor has already done that. And I think the governor has a more powerful, influential voice than we do as a commission.
I'll just do a quick process check. I also think that to try to get this group right now to land on a guidance would be no easier than going through line by line our policy recommendations. And I think at this point we need high level agreement on the messages that we're trying to send. And I think the message we're trying to send here is the collective call to action. Oliver, those are your words. The call to action part is your words. What I think is on the table to kind of move it into a more positive and collaborative frame is to eliminate the piece about blame in general. And that's essentially elevate a collective call to action and move directly to, we recognize that we're not going to address the policy challenges. I'm not going to reread the paragraph, but essentially eliminate the middle part, as Jay is suggesting, and be focused on. And then there, and there is no silver bullet solution is the last sentence of that paragraph.
And the call to action reference collaboration and
Yes.
new ways of thinking, creativity, whatever.
Yep. And shared responsibility was another note I had.
You're talking about these 2 paragraphs and 2 paragraphs only at this point, correct?
Correct.
Are you, Megan, drafting or redrafting something based on this conversation?
Yes.
I will be impressed if you captured all. Would you like assistance from anyone?
I would always take wordsmithing.
I understand that, but I mean, you want to collaborate with somebody offline, if you will.
Well, at this
Then to
point,
put it to the
at this
group.
point, frankly, I'm going to redraft. It's going to go to the full commission. You will give me your input and it's going to go to the steering group for final wordsmithing. I just don't have time, frankly, to schedule another meeting with another smaller
Is
group.
that the December 11th meeting?
Yeah.
So the rest of us can join that as if we can.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'm going to keep us moving. Yep, sorry, I skipped over you.
I think it's really important when we talk about the call to action that we're thinking about the broader transformational strategies that are going to set us on a path to have a high quality education for every student, equitable and sustainable. And I understand that we also need to be very mindful of the short-term cost containment because that has a very dramatic and felt impact both on schools and on taxpayers. But I think we need to always maintain that dual focus because the short-term cost containment isn't getting us to the world-class education that's equitable and sustainable. And I just think it's important that call to action be collaborative, but also recognize that we're going to need to think deeply about how we fund and deliver education, which will likely require us to challenge assumptions and to really put students at the center of all conversations around what's going to be in the best interest of students across the state of Vermont. Just a tip of your words there.
I've got lots of notes. Something will come out of them all.
In my comment, we went to the, when we discussed the background section, the part I circled was to study the provision of education in Vermont and make recommendations for a statewide vision for public education. And that's the piece. I think we all come from different silos. What we're trying to do at this table is to put away those silos, not cast blame, but at the same time recognize that our system, we have a democratic system that's been built on decades, not centuries of work. And our job really is to come back to that, in this next phase of our work, come back to that statewide vision and find where those different areas fit into that overall vision. So I would agree that that's something that we should highlight in this call to action.
Great.
Maybe it could be the fact that cost containment is necessary, but not sufficient in the long term, and that we may not have the time to come up with specific recommendations that the governor has put on a goalpost, and that could be leveraged as a tool. As we're really creating that broader call to action around the transformational strategies.
Okay. So I'm going to do a time check. We are, I think that we are able to shorten our time around the consultant for sure. So I think I think it makes sense to keep going, but I would just encourage us to make sure that we're staying at a sufficient, is this saying what we want it to say? And if not, then we absolutely need to talk about it. But if it is a step below that too, I think it would sound better if it was X. We still do that, but that would be better done offline. And several of you did do that already, and they're not integrated in here yet. So.
Well, can I make a request too? Hearing Oliver's comment about that goalpost and what that is, I have to admit I was multitasking and reading Craig's letter, but it would be helpful to hear from the tax commissioner about his letter at some point soon.
I would suggest that we get through this part, and then before we get to, so right at the bottom of the draft summary chart about data requests is preliminary data findings. And that's sort of like high level summary. And I wonder if that's the right spot to do an update on there.
I don't have the agenda in front of me. Are we going to do the executive session after public comment?
It's not built that way, but we certainly could to keep public comment where we want
have
to be.
an extra hour. built
We
in
do.
if we need it.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion too. All right, reasonable timeframes for impact. This is basically respectfully stating that this was a really challenging timeframe, and that it's a very complicated topic. And that the most important point I think we wanted to make is how complicated it is, and that this is not And that's why this report looks the way it is. I think that's the gist of what we were looking to do. Any comments on that section? This is where it references the governor's letter. Okay, to move on.
Is this where you would add the December letter?
Add the, sorry, oh,
Would you
good,
add the
we
December
could,
letter?
yeah, that's, yep, it could go here. Yep,
Add what? I'm sorry.
the
The
December one letter.
letter
Oh,
to this section.
Yep.
Yeah. Good. Okay, data analysis. This is really just a section that talks through how we've talked about data so far, what we asked for, and then it includes, this is just meant to be a simplified version of the spreadsheet that Zoe shared with all of us. We don't need to do it now, but if I cut and paste error, we should make sure that there aren't any cut and paste errors. But I think the thing that commission should just weigh in on is it useful for the legislature to see the amount of data that we have asked for and the current status of it? Nicole?
Yes.
Okay.
I think it illustrates the complexity.
That's exactly,
Exactly. And the amount of work that the AOE has put into responding to these requests.
Yeah, I think both are really important points to make.
And just forecasting that all of that data is going to be given to the General Assembly for them to look at and then have some good conversations.
Yes.
I made a note in my comments to you, Megan. I think it's more editorial, but also without that data, which we don't have. It's not a fault of the AOE. It's just we're asking for a lot and still getting it, and it's coming in and refining it. Our report necessarily then lacks some credibility. I said 100% in my draft, but I know that not a great sentence I was playing with, but we need more to make better recommendations. The legislature needs more information with which to make better decisions. We all need more, and it's coming.
Yeah, I would want to be careful that the message we're sending is that we've committed to having data for each one of these recommendations. And so we need more time to fully do that. I think I don't want to call in frankly, I don't want to call in to question the credibility of the commission in general. But I mean, I do hear what you're saying. I think this is just meant to say, this is exactly how complex it is. We know we need to deep dive in, because I also would say we have an awful lot of this. We just have not had the time yet to go now back into each policy recommendation. That's
right.
Or have a discussion at the commission level about.
Exactly.
This should be.
Exactly. Zoe.
I just caution against analysis paralysis, which could occur where we want to keep going deeper and diving into areas because we're not quite sure what recommendation to make. So I do think there is a really substantial body of data that we've been able to pull together to really elucidate some very critical themes that could inform a more narrow view of how we approach policy recommendations. And I would suggest that we frame that as such, that these are discrete inquiries, but we need to challenge ourselves as a commission to really leverage the information we have now to zero in on a couple key policy areas that we want to explore more deeply. Understanding that those policy areas would also require some additional data. So I do think we need to make sure we are striking a good balance because, you know, even though we re-release state profiles for us, the statewide trends hold, and they've been pretty consistent. So it's now a matter of how do we start thinking concretely around strategies, and I do think we need to accelerate that work and still be very disciplined around bringing in data. But there's an opportunity now to really focus and cohere around a couple key areas to move the work forward. Because I do think we owe it to our students to move as quickly as we can. And I think we have a lot of information to build on. So I think it would be helpful, one, to kind of frame this as that, right? This is kind of an initial list of data, inquiries, and exploration, but then we are making that commitment to get more refined as we move forward. So you'll start to see more focused path that's going to clearly lead to some policy recommendations. And then just as a procedural note, I would ask that I have an opportunity to update this before.
Yes. Actually, I was hoping that you would.
And some of the links are broken. So.
I just have a follow-up question to that. So are you suggesting that we include in the report some of the state level trends, like that we cite some data?
That's,
Because I would agree with that.
we
have a lot of data and for us not to say anything about, trends and trajectories does seem like a miss.
so it's not a miss, it's incomplete. So the first question is just simply, is the commission okay with the reprinting, which we need to work, like make sure that it's properly reprinted, but reprinting the chart? That's the first question. I think that's a yes. The second piece I need help with, and that is preliminary data findings. What is it we want to highlight? There's some things pulled out here, but there's 6 bullets pulled out. You put more bullets just in your presentation today. And that I think, and Nicole, I fully agree with you.
About that.
Nope. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important. We really have a pretty good sense of these trends. We know some of the patterns, by size and by need. We know some patterns by geography. There's certainly some additional data that we need to investigate, but I think we need to be able to articulate some of those broad trends. A lot of that's included in the state education profile report, and also in the education funding report. We start to think about future considerations. They're bringing those together in ways that are not foregone conclusions, but at least we're starting to get more concrete around what are some of the paths forward.
Jennifer.
So 2 questions. Are we now under preliminary data findings?
Yes.
Okay. Could I suggest that maybe Zoe update this section based on what the agency has sort of pulled out, and then that gets put into the updated report that then gets sent to, but that we can maybe delegate to Zoe in the first instance to.
I was going to suggest it too, but I'm glad someone else put something on Zoe's list, not me.
I support that. I also think it might be helpful to move this narrative
To the top.
chart
Yeah.
because it helps.
Yeah.
Like I got lost.
Yeah, I think this shows a level of rigor, right? And that's helpful.
Yeah.
But I also think we need to be able to tell the story. Any call out.
Does it boil down to expanding the number of bullet points? So we're basically saying.
Maybe refining them.
My thought was to take some of what we've learned and put that into paragraph form.
Agreed. I wasn't even intending that this had to be bullets. I was trying to, they're placeholders.
Okay. Would you be able to kind of focus from the end date back? So this needs to come out on, would you say Friday?
Friday the 13th.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is it possible, since we.
I just don't think anybody's doing anything on Sunday the 15th.
And you said this was going to go out to the full commission for kind of a review.
Yes.
But we really won't have a chance to, in a public session, have discussions about those additions. Is it possible to kind of break it up and have some discussion? We have a finance committee next Monday and then a steering committee, I think you said Wednesday.
This body could decide to meet again. We don't have to, like, we could use either one of those time slots as a full commission meeting.
I think there's a lot of work that's going to happen from now until the final report that would be valuable for.
That's actually, yeah, next meeting agenda does not have to just be our January meeting cadence. Finance committee members, since a good chunk of you are here, is that that would give, so the finance committee is scheduled to meet on Monday the 9th, and the steering group is meeting Wednesday the 11th.
I was going to say, it might make sense to put it where the steering committee meeting is, to have that be a full commission.
That works. Does that work for
What time?
It may not work perfectly, but for a quorum of the commission,
8:30, I think it is.
it's 8:30 to 10.
Should be on
The 11th.
Yeah, it would be a Teams meeting, I suspect. I mean, the in-person location would probably just be the agency. I think I will be virtual, but
I do have a concept.
I think so does Nicole. Well, so the other proposal would be to use the 9th as a steering group / full commission meeting.
My concern is that, well, that's a lot of pressure on the secretary to pull things together all week.
I'm not sure that there's a significant difference between Friday the 13th and Friday the 20th, other than what it says in statute.
Or Monday the 16th.
Well, I was wondering, doesn't it roll to the next business day?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I agree.
Whenever possible, we should probably avoid assuming we're going to work over the weekend, though. As the person who does the bulk of the writing at the moment over the weekend, as I know Zoe does a lot of that too. So I like Friday the 20th, but I am not the General Assembly, and the law says the 15th, and I'm a rule follower.
Peter Common is.
If Friday the 20th is feasible.
I don't think there'd be any objection from the two members of the
Yeah.
General Assembly.
It's not
20th.
unusual for the chairs to get a notice that a report's going to be late. If it's okay with them. Usually okay.
So you're telling me to hand my homework in late.
What are we gonna have, a detention or something?
I mean, I would just note I submitted the December 1 letter on December 2nd.
All right, great, got it.
So if we're getting thrown in jail for that, I guess they're gonna have to come get me.
So when would the commission then like to meet is really the question. And I'm saying that to try to avoid a doodle just because it takes a long time for that. So current bookmarked dates are the 9th, the 11th, and then at least the communication subcommittee has a meeting on the 16th because that would have been our normal subcommittee cadence.
That's an 8 a.m. meeting.
I would think the 16th would be a good time if we're
Okay.
going to push to the 20th.
Okay, so let's
I
do
could
8:30.
Okay.
Yep, go ahead, Ann.
I'm booked, I think, on the 16th. I'd have to go down, grab my calendar. But you can go without me.
Do we have, could do a quick raise of the hand? Let's say 8:30 on Monday, the 16th for a full commission meeting. That's well more than a quorum. Sorry, John.
Big Red's holding a legislative breakfast.
8:30 to what?
8:30 to 10, I'm thinking. I don't know. The commission, you tell me.
Yeah.
How long do you think?
8:30 to 10.
8:30 to 10? Okay, so
The only agenda item.
the only agenda item, yes. So that, Suzanne and Maureen will notice that and put that in our calendars. Thank you. What I think that means is that the Communication and Engagement Committee won't meet on the 16th. We'll just have a full commission meeting.
And what about the steering group?
Is-
So we know I can be there on the 11th.
Yeah, steering group. The 11th was a like interim scheduled meeting. Does it make sense to do it on Monday, the 9th? Because
the
the,
finance committee meeting, the steering committee meeting.
right. Well, I don't know that I'm allowed to say, I'm not on the finance committee.
Triple booked on Monday, so the 9th.
I thought the steering committee was meeting to finalize and approve the letter. So if we're doing that as a full commission on the 16th, then that makes me wonder what is our agenda for steering committee meeting.
Steering group, are you, the only thing that I would say is I do think the steering group needs to meet at some point in December, unless the commission is rethinking the January 6th meeting date. I'm getting into the agenda look ahead, but once this report is put out, it really changes our work plan a little bit, not changes, but it causes us to say, okay, now how are we organizing ourselves for the next 12 months as we do this bigger work? And the steering group is the entity charged with steering. So the group needs to meet before January. So I think that, Jennifer, you're right. I think the steering group could just not meet before the 16th, make that be an all-inclusive meeting. Steering group could also meet right after the full commission meeting on the 16th to do agenda planning, if you want to just keep it to the 16th. I saw some head nods, so maybe that's actually the best option. So I think Maureen and Suzanne, it's a full commission meeting on Monday, the 16th, 8:30 to 10, and then a 10 o'clock steering group meeting.
1 hour.
1 hour for agenda planning.
Okay.
Can you say that one more time,
8:30
Megan?
to 10, I have
Yep.
an appointment at 10:30, so I won't make the steering group. That works.
So I think, Craig, it's 8:30 to 10, full commission meeting, Monday, the 16th, 10 to 11, steering group meeting. I suspect both of those meetings will be virtual with the on-site location being AOE.
The
Just
10 to
because
11
they're-
is also on the 16th.
Yeah,
Okay, gotcha. Thank you. And that means we're losing the one on the 11th.
I believe so, because 2 out of the 6 members at least are not able to make it.
Okay, I gotcha.
Okay. Okay, well, that's helpful and so it's still, we still, I think, need to move our way through this so that we know what we're redrafting essentially, because that's what needs to come out before the 16th. Okay. Where were we? So I think, so Zoe is going to update the preliminary data findings part. We're going to move it to the top of that section, and then we are keeping the chart. And the reason I just wanted to add to the other reason, frankly, that I think the chart is important is this body is also criticized for not looking at data. And I think we should make it really clear that we are. And also that we understand that we're going to find out that we need more data as we go through the process. So
This chart is also going to be very helpful for the General Assembly. Right, it's in there.
great. Okay, so now is the coming into the conversation is the piece that those of you who did send feedback in advance, most of the feedback is in here. This is the review of potential policy actions. So I'm going to suggest we take this in 2 parts. The intention here is that we are not making policy recommendations. So the first thing is we should make abundantly clear that those first few paragraphs say that. The intention here was to surface the brainstorms that have been talked about and let folks know that we have not been able to go through these. If we take this in 2 parts, the first part is the idea that we would include the full list of brainstorms as part 1. Like, I would like the commission to talk about whether or not that is indeed what we want to do. That's been our operating assumption, but that's confirmed. Then I think then we can look into, this also is a summary chart of the chart the Finance Committee has been working off of. So there may be cut and paste errors. There may be things that are missing. At least a couple of pieces of feedback I've gotten is that there is something missing. So I would need people to surface that. And then people had individual comments that I won't try to speak on your behalf. You can share about lines in here. And I don't know that I don't think it's instructive to start there, because I think we need to start with, does the commission agree that all of the ideas go to the General Assembly as essentially a status update? So that's how I'd like to open the conversation.
With that question,
Yes,
I would say, why not?
maybe we go around. Let's go around and have everyone weigh in on that idea. And Jay, since you started, we'll go this way and then we'll go to the folks on the
Sorry
screen.
about that.
Sorry, Jay.
I just think that's what we should be doing. We should put everything out there, even ideas that we don't agree with, for discussion purposes, and the General Assembly should have information to all that thinking, even if it's thinking that some of us could personally disagree with, and we'll have the opportunity to testify in the General Assembly about things we like and don't like. I think we want to give as broad a scope as we possibly can.
Mike?
I would agree. We should include everything. When we talked about this at the policy, at the finance committee, there were some areas we had discussed would not be beneficial, but including everything in gives a good overview of what has been discussed and gives some additional data for the General Assembly.
I agree. And I think this may be an opportunity to say something along the lines of, you kind of hint at it here, but, you know, why have this commission? Why should this commission continue to exist? And my personal belief is that it provides a venue for folks from the field, folks from the administration, folks from the legislature to have conversations around things that maybe people had originally thought, I don't want to talk about that, or that should be off the table, to engage in that kind of dialogue and in a setting that is public, transparent, but not as pressurized as the State House. And so that's where I would love to sort of, you know, flag for the commission can be used as some of these policy ideas gain traction or not gain traction. And I think you say this, Megan, but maybe we could say it directly, that the commission is a body that can, you know, has the right people in the right roles. We're not all the people, we've already acknowledged that. Yep. And we have this robust public engagement process where we can start to, as a direction starts to take shape, bring the public into that conversation. We are a mechanism for, I think, a different approach than has been taken.
Thank you. I realized, I skipped you, Peter.
He was out of
Oh, I did. Just a quick response to that too, or just so that we put a pin in it. That idea is listed as a recommendation, and the recommendations are at the very bottom. And we should think about whether or not, once we affirm them, should they go to the top as more of an executive summary. So we'll come back to that. Peter, the question is just, this first go round is just, are we still in agreement that it is instructive to include all of the policy brainstorms in the chart, essentially?
I would say yes. The General Assembly should have a clear understanding of what's implied here. That it's not necessarily an endorsement of a path forward, but it's rather representative of putting everything on the table and then discussing it. So yes.
I agree with keeping all of it in, and also because I think it also points to the complexity of the issue, and by keeping even those things that maybe were not necessarily something we thought needed to be in there, we wanted to make sure that everything was included so that everyone understands what's already been discussed and that nothing is taken off.
Zoe?
I suggest we add additional framing to this section. I think in the description, it indicates that this list of ideas will be a starting point, but it's hard to look at this as a starting point because the recommendations are actually very contradictory. So I think we need to reframe that. This really isn't a starting point, and name some of the tension and some of the debate that is inherent in the contradictory ideas that are being put forward. And even though, you know, it says these are a list of ideas, these are absolutely being interpreted as recommendations. And so I think it's our responsibility to name the underlying tension behind these recommendations and make sure that that's clear. I know the administration doesn't support a number of these ideas. And so it's just really important that it's framed appropriately to be representative of the conversation. And I would really challenge the commission to get more concrete around what areas we should be exploring. If that's done in this report, at least that the conclusion of this section is recognizing that we need to start addressing these underlying tensions and move forward on a path that we think will be sustainable and productive.
Thanks, sorry. Oliver?
Yeah, I go back to the enabling legislation and specifically that the report contain preliminary findings and recommendations. And to Zoe's point, I don't think it matters how we try to frame it. These things are going to be interpreted as recommendations. And the fact is, we haven't, as a commission, discussed any of them in any depths, and none of them have been really fully vetted. So I wouldn't feel comfortable putting some of the, certainly some of these things I already know are just not built on accurate information. And I just don't feel we're, I don't think it would be helpful to put all these things out there at this stage.
Thanks. Jennifer?
So I had sent this to Megan, and I'm just going to share it with everyone because it does pertain to this. I think my first suggestion was after the sentence, by design, this report does not include specific recommendations. I think it's important to note that the reason for this is that we're still collecting data and feel that it would be prudent to have the opportunity to discuss and analyze the data before formulating any recommendation, just to make it clear. And then note that these are complex issues. We've talked about that a lot. But also, I suggested changing potential solutions to factors that may ultimately form the basis of any recommendation that the commission makes. Again, to make it clear that we're just putting this information out there. These are not recommendations. We've not had a chance to discuss them as a group and take a vote on anything. But to your specific question about do I think that the spreadsheet should be included? I do, because I think we've done an awful lot of work collecting information, underlying data, pros and cons, and I would hope that that will only benefit the General Assembly to have a jump start on its work when they convene in January.
Thanks. John?
I have some strong reservations. I agree with, I think, Zoe and Oliver articulating this. These are going to be perceived as recommendations, even though we're trying to make a distinction between the difference between brainstorming and considering things and making recommendations. I do think there's a distinct difference, and I think it would take a lot of work for us to be able to provide that context and that understanding. I can even think from my own experience working with school boards that at times I would start with considerations and then I'd move to a point of recommendations. So I just think we have to be very clear, because I think there's a danger in giving license to the legislature to say, basically, we've thought of this, so it's a valid idea, right? Even though we're maybe not making a recommendation, I think we're giving license to certain things. And of course, no surprise, my concerns are around school size. This is a question for the Finance Committee. With personnel essentially being 75 to 80% of the cost drivers, why do we have a section on school size and not a section on personnel? And is it only personnel that's is related to school size, or is it personnel related to all schools? Because that's, again, this sort of hidden bias that I really feel starts to come out, is that this is about personnel in small schools. It's not about personnel as large schools. There are large schools that need to make decisions about personnel, but that doesn't come out as even a consideration. So I just feel like there has to be a real careful and thoughtful approach to putting these on the table, because I think otherwise we're basically giving license to the legislature. School merger is a public policy consideration.
Thanks, John.
So it's an interesting, the table divide here, because I'm going to agree with my friends here on this side of the table. So we're 5-5. We'll be interested to see how the online folks and Megan, you'll perhaps break the tie. But I tend to agree with my colleagues here. I think that it is unlikely that these will be seen in any other way than as a recommendation. And I'm probably going to be inconsistent perhaps internally in this, but I do think, for example, on the healthcare side, we ought to be asking and discussing universal healthcare. We've talked about that for years in the state, and that ought to be on the table. It could achieve enormous administrative cost savings for the state, for education, public sector, private sector, for everybody. So I would suggest we add that to the list if we're going to add a list. But I do worry that we're going to, I don't know how we frame the introduction to make this clear to the legislature. I'm sure Peter and Ann that you will understand this and spread this word to your colleagues, but these are not recommendations. There were early discussion points that have not been fully analyzed and need to be analyzed for the impact on small schools versus large schools versus on students, on taxpayers and everything, because there may be ups and downs to any one of these, ideas that are positive or negative that we don't know. So I'm concerned about the introductory paragraph, how we frame that. I think ultimately they're just ideas, but I worry that they will be perceived as recommendations in some way or another, or in some circles. And therefore, I think that we should add universal health care to that, which I made a recommendations in my notes.
We could bold, these are not recommendations.
Well, I'm going to get to the people of the screen, and then I'll remind us that this is not under the recommendation section. Craig, and then Anne.
Just trying to think of things that I haven't heard a lot about to try to add value. I guess I just worry about our ability to. I feel like you've got to have the whole list or no list, because I don't think we're going to have enough time to come to a consensus on which pieces should be part of the list. In the finance subcommittee, I think Mike said this, there were ones that the finance subcommittee does not believe are good ideas and should not be pursued. And those are on the list too, in an effort to not have people later come and say, well, how come this one isn't on the list, right? And have that be a distraction from the discussion. So I guess I lean toward having a list, but I also, just trying to think of a way to reframe it, because I'm hearing and I share everybody's concerns about it being misconstrued as a list of recommendations. I think maybe that opening paragraph can just be very straight to the point of like, these are not recommendations. They should not be considered recommendations. They are a reflection of brainstorming and a reflection of just like, maybe they're more like meeting minutes than recommendations, right? It's really a reflection of discussions that have been had. I don't know if I don't know. There's more work to be done there, but I hear that point. I think there's probably a way to get there. But I lean toward having a list.
Thanks, Craig. Anne, and then I have a possible suggestion.
Okay.
Anne, go ahead.
Probably for the only time this year, I'm going to agree with the tax commissioner. The legislature, the legislature is going to do what it's going to do. This is saying, this is the list that we came up with. We haven't had time to look at any of it. It just gives us a base. We will add and subtract. It just clerically saves my committee 2 hours of going through the same process that the finance subcommittee went through. I'm going to give them the list and we're going to say, okay, let's go through what's not on here. And and then start working through. And I will get a whiteboard in there this year so we can cross things off as we go. But I think it's helpful. Basically, there'll be 2 committees that are going to do this. And I think we're both anticipating having very new committees. So there's going to be an awful lot of background work we have to do, and anything that helps is helpful. So I like it.
Thanks, Anne. So I don't think, I know it's not a vote, I don't think I'd be a tiebreaker. I think most of I'm going to say this way, because I too think it's instructive for the General Assembly to know what we've been talking about. It lends credibility to this construct to say, we really are unearthing all of it. And I completely agree with those who are pointing out rightly that people will read it as recommendations. So there's sort of this very clear theme to rewrite the introduction to this to make it very clear that these are not recommendations. My other wondering is, this is meant to be a more readable version of the Ed Finance spreadsheet, but what if it's not put in here as a cleaned up spreadsheet, and instead we simply link it to the document, the active document that the Finance Subcommittee is using. So it meets the spirit that the majority of this commission has, which is that it is important to the legislature to see what's been discussed and to see the current state of the analysis. But it does take the emphasis a little bit away if it is a link in this document instead of a chart. So that might be oversimplifying people's concerns, but it also eliminates any cut and paste wordsmithing challenge. It would simply be linking to probably the Ed Finance minutes where that document is reflected. So that's a thought, Nicole.
I'm not sure people will put on a link. So.
It's fair.
But I agree that if it's just, this is what was discussed, then any sort of edits to that sort of run counter to our.
Right.
So I would support the appendix that has
the whole thing
just the whole
printed.
thing,
Yeah.
printed so people can access it easily. The other thing I just wanted to suggest, I think, to get at some of Billy's comments was if we can make some connection between the preliminary findings and the recommendations around the General Assembly, this is just the laundry list of ideas, none of which are very new. Many of them have been discussed, right? And I think our hope was that there wouldn't be any new ideas that hadn't come through the commission that hadn't had any kind of opportunity for discussion, but there may be other ideas out there. But to me, it's important to make a connection between the policy focus should be connected to the areas of need or the problem statement that has been identified. And just saying that could be helpful to bridge that sort of gap between. We hadn't had enough time to do that work, but that is the intersection of what the data are telling us and what policy levers are available. That's the next phase of work. We know the General Assembly is going to do that, and we're here to partner with them.
I think it's directional.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's important to note this was a working document.
Right.
And we do have a meeting next Monday, so we could take comments from the commission and continue this as a, improve upon it, based on, Emily did some of the initial work, I did some formatting work, and this is a cleaned up version from what I submitted last weekend. So I would suggest that we take a look and give subcommittees some guidance to clean this up next Monday.
Thanks, Mike. Peter.
I'm only just pointing out on page 15, it says in bold, very heavily, that these are not consensus recommendations, but rather a summary description of options raised.
Yes. Thank you. I think of this, it sounds like we want that even more in this first paragraph.
Larger font.
Maybe.
People have to sign up for both if they're read.
Jennifer, and then Zoe, and then Oliver.
Well, and I think it also might be helpful to note that we might change this spread, like we might add more things to the spreadsheet as we continue our conversation. So, as Zoe mentioned earlier, this is a point in time. This is where we are right now. And so we will update the General Assembly as we update the spreadsheet.
Yeah. But also that reality lends itself to inserting it as is with a link to the live work that also reinforces what it is and what it isn't. Zoe.
We want to acknowledge that it is in bold, that these are ideas, these are policy recommendations. But I do think when people look at a list, they will assume some coherence, given the level of importance of this report and this work. And I think in that framing, what I mean by naming tensions, there are some recommendations that are focused on generating new revenue. There are others that are thinking about maximizing existing funds. Like, I think the inherent tension in the recommendations is important to call out. In other words, not a coherent set of recommendations that could be implemented together. Some of them are at odds. And I think just naming that is really helpful and shows the level of where we are in terms of the exploration. And there's a lot of other tensions that are we brought up through this conversation as well that I think are just helpful to name, because those are things we're going to need to wrestle with as we move forward.
Oliver?
Yeah, I think where I'm still struggling is that by putting it in the report, even if we put on it, oh, these are not recommendations, it still implies that there's been some level of analysis done. And we have not had any substantive discussion on any of these issues as a commission, and that bothers me. I think it would be a different conversation if we had been having conversation, had some time to explore these ideas, analyze them. And we just haven't had that. And I think putting it in a report would imply that we have.
I want to say one thing related to that, and then Jeff, first of all, the paragraph could make clear that the discussions around these ideas are currently situated in the Ed Finance Committee and not the full commission, which helps that. The second thing is, I think it's important, it might be in here or it's not clear in here. What's in that list is from the commission, because that original spreadsheet came from brainstorms that we did when we came around. They have not, and brainstorms of the Ed Finance Committee and public comment. So somewhere in here it does describe that, but probably not clearly enough. And the only reason I say that is, again, I do think it's important to know that the brainstorms came from a collective. It's absolutely true. The full commission hasn't line by line gone through the merits of them, but in terms of where the list came from, it came from multiple sources. Jeff?
I agree, Oliver. I added a sentence, just you would have seen that sentence to Megan about the analysis, the lacking of analysis of any of these in the bold right after the summary description options, you know, that sentence where it's bolded, as Zoe pointed out. I would bold that there has been no analysis.
Well, that's not true. I mean, I think Megan's point is the analysis and discussion has been at the finance.
Right.
Level. It's not that there has been none. It's just, it hasn't been done by the full.
And I'm looking at the full spreadsheet, and I think the points are well taken, and I think there are some things that need to be included. The full spreadsheet included contingencies, dependencies, questions, so again, I think there are some pieces that we could incorporate that would address some of the concerns.
Yeah, I actually like the idea of it as is. It makes it much more clear, and it avoids anything being lost in translation, or because these columns were done with the thought of simplifying. And that means that some of those columns are all merged together. And I think it is much safer, frankly, to leave it if it's going in. John?
I fully recognize the time crunch we've all been on. And so, you know, the work that the Finance Committee has done is really good work. Right? I really appreciate that. And so certainly collectively, we're going to find things and see things differently than just that subgroup. And, you know, the reality is we as a full commission haven't looked at that since the 4th or 5th of November, and things changed, right? And so I've tried to faithfully tune into those meetings and listen and try to learn and be prepared. But, you know, again, there's no mystery that, you know, I'm going to continue to advocate for small rural schools in the state, is that was not part of our original brainstorm, right? When we first started as a full commission, that wasn't on the radar. I understand this is an iterative process, right? Things are going to come up the next meeting and the next meeting. If we keep meeting, we'll keep finding more, you know, ideas and solutions. I just feel like something of that magnitude of us considering school district mergers and putting that on the list has a lot of weight, right? And it's, you know, indicated that the fiscal impact is high, right? But that goes back to what Oliver's, we don't know that. That's an assumption. It may be, it may not be, it may be in certain cases, it may not be in certain cases. So I do think it's partly a timing issue that we really haven't had the time as a full commission to discuss some of these things, that I'm concerned. And certainly I agree that without research, analysis, and a deep data dive, it's really hard for us to make concrete recommendations. That said, I understand the expectations of the legislature is that we're going to fix it, right? That we're going to come up with meaningful policy solutions. And the reality is we don't have a lot of levers that we can put forward for this coming session. Again, I really applaud the thoughtful work that we have done collectively, the thoughtful work of the Finance Committee. It is going to take time. And I just worry that if we prematurely put things out on the table, it creates panic in our school districts. And it, I think, gives license to the legislature, even though we put in bold, right? These are not recommendations. The fact that they are somehow legitimized, I think, is problematic in my opinion.
I think one of the biggest challenges with this work is that the strong feeling about any one of these things exists everywhere. And unfortunately, and at some point, we're going to have to figure out how to navigate through that. I think it's a little bit like Craig's, either it's the whole list or no list. And I think the vast majority of the commission believes it's instructive with very careful language to include the list as long as it's very clear what the list is. Because the challenge with omitting or not omitting is that people will take it. And again, and I've said this before too, when you read in the public about what are we going to do about property taxes, this commission is rarely mentioned. And that's okay to some extent. It actually allows us to do our work. But on the other hand, if we don't say anything of substance, we risk being irrelevant. And the General Assembly they could take action to change our charge. They could take action to discontinue this commission. They could do a lot of things. But right now, our job is to give them something. So I don't know if I think, let me say it this way. I think that we do not, this is a proposal. Is it true that maybe we don't need to take action today because what we should do is summarize the revised draft that you all will then consider on the 16th. You'll get it before the 16th, but so because of that, I don't think that we're headed to action. Is that an accurate statement? Okay. I saw your hand.
That's what I was gonna say.
Oh,
I was gonna say,
before I
can we
started.
make a final decision on this on the 16th?
Yes. But the draft, because of there is a vast majority of folks who think that the ideas should be surfaced. So the draft that you see will have that in there that way. This commission will still, and when I say will be in there that way, what I think it will be is the printed or PDF of the actual Excel spreadsheet, probably the one that you create after the 9th, just so it has one more finance committee meetings worth of discussion, and then it will be in there as an appendix, and this will be rewritten.
The language before it.
Yes, completely rewritten. I have a lot of notes. Yep.
Just quick process question. So the finance committee will meet again and they can revise their own spreadsheet.
Yes.
I think addressing some of the concerns that John had.
Yes.
They're not locked in on it just because we are today saying we're going to use the full spreadsheet.
And I guess that's just what I would, ask and encourage, that the finance committee take another look. And you've heard from your colleagues on the full commission and just say, okay, does it make sense for us to have a school size section, or does it make more sense for us to have a personnel section? Again, I respect the work that's been done. I just feel that it's important to also bring up a different perspective and a different idea. And I will trust that people will give that some thought and maybe come back with a different iteration. And then once again, we will make a final decision on the 16th as a group.
That's been very helpful comments.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anne, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's fine to send this as a brainstorming. It's not even a recommendation from the finance committee. It is a brainstorm. It's a list, a partial list of solutions. We've already said there is no one solution. I think if we leave out something as large as possible mergers, maybe at the district or superintendency, I mean, if we leave that out, it kind of impacts our credibility, because that's going to be added to the list in the legislature. It's been identified by PICUS as one of the issues we face, and I think we can't just arbitrarily take that off the table. It's on there whether we want it or not. Doesn't mean it's going to go anywhere, but it is on the list.
Thanks, Anne. I wanted to just really quickly, before we have a little bit of public comment and then executive session, there are 3 recommendations in this draft. I did put out there that whatever we do, if these are the right recommendations, should probably be at the top. This has actually more to do with what Nicole said earlier, is that the first recommendation is to use the commission for analysis and feedback on potential legislative actions. Essentially just sort of the legislators put this commission into action, use it. And if that means a slightly revised version of what's written in 183, so be it. Let this body be a go-between between the things brainstormed. And that's really, the second one is ensure cohesion in efforts to develop policy recommendations. And that is, maybe that's actually a version of the same thing. But, you know, you've got agency doing really good work. And we've already talked about it's like we're marching next to each other. And I think doing a pretty good job of linking the two, but is there a way to do that even better? Or simply just make sure the General Assembly knows that this work is overlapping. So it's about cohesion. And then this third is just simply continue to ensure substantive, equitable community engagement. That has more to do with, we've identified that as a goal of this commission. And that's almost more of a next step than it is a recommendation. But thoughts, reactions on these?
I added in my comments to you, Megan, I think we've got to add some component of student outcomes. I gave you a draft paragraph, but it certainly, at a minimum, we ought to be not doing any harm to student outcomes.
Say more about that. I will.
Well, I said ensure proposed changes improve student outcomes, or at the very least, the changes are examined.
Oh, right. So my thought, just from my perspective, is I think that's part of our guiding principles, is the quality it does have to do with student outcomes. So I don't know that that's a recommendation. We've already identified that when we vet our recommendations, we would do that through, I'm only speaking as one person of the commission. In my mind, that's part of what we have said.
Maybe there's just some restating of our guiding principles.
Oh, that's
just to sort of go full circle to say, remember our guiding principles. These are the, you know.
Although aren't we moving this up to, like, so it's not at the end of the report?
Yeah, and it's funny, it does, we do, well, we not substantively, but we do restate the 3 guiding principles at the very last paragraph. But you're right, it will now be moved up.
I think the whole report will be somewhat shorter if you move those charts into appendices.
Yes.
Then it'll just be more narrative.
Yeah.
And then
that's good.
you may not need an executive summary of.
Well, actually, that also makes me think, Zoe, if we are moving the finance into a spreadsheet as an appendix, the same thing we don't need to rewrite yours. We can just, not yours, but the agency's document, which is a live spreadsheet. It's the data request, sorry.
Yeah, I think we can certainly link to the data report, but I still think that section needs some framing around the trends.
Yes, it still would. That would be the narrative piece. I think what I'm saying is if we're including, right, like I have both charts in this current draft as
In the body.
Right, in the body, both could be pulled out and just be the actual one in both cases.
Yeah.
Okay.
As of whatever date.
Right, yeah.
And did you still have a comment?
No, I thought I took my hand down. Sorry.
Nope, no worries.
Let's go.
Okay. Anything else? Knowing your, sorry, go ahead, Craig.
Yeah.
Man, I'm bad at this.
Well, no, I just put my hand up. I worry I'm introducing a problem without a solution. I worry about, I think we do have to have a discussion about what we want the role of the commission to be during the legislative session, because I worry about the ability to be quick and dynamic enough to keep up with the conversation, right? Like in the legislative process, if they're in the middle of doing that kind of stuff, right? Usually what I'm used to is like, can your team come back tomorrow and talk more about this, right? And then the analysts will work overnight, and there is that real time crunch, right? So we're used to having monthly meetings and then bi-weekly meetings of other groups. It's just, I think we'll have to have an honest discussion about the way to add value there, how to use the forum of having all of the stakeholders together. I don't know if having it be sort of a go-between will be the right outcome, but I don't know what that right outcome is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to raise. Honestly, Craig, my part of it is it's a significant amount of work that this commission is dedicating to this. And if the General Assembly prefers to, and I don't, I mean no malice in saying this, if the General Assembly is going to do this work, I'm not sure how much time and energy should be spent by this commission if it is not ultimately going to be able to impact, which may be more of a target the role of the commission. But if the legislature intends to, they have convened this body, they've created it. If they've changed their mind or want to refine the duties, I think they need to do that. But as it stands right now, it would be a third body doing parallel work, right? It would be the agency, the legislature, and the commission, which may be the cohesion piece. I too don't have an answer for your comment. I think it's really valid, but yeah, Peter.
I too have thought a lot about this because obviously there's a lot of conversations going on right now. And the speed at which the legislature can move and the speed at which this body can move may be two different things. But I think that's where the role of the steering committee is going to be very important and is probably going to need to meet with legislative leaders in January to sort of say, okay, who's doing what and how can each be a resource to the other.
Oliver.
And on that point, I think where the commission is just not, to Craig's point, it's just not well structured and never will be. It's not the fault of anybody in the commission to deal with any sort of short-term solutions, right? I think maybe that might be helpful to think about as a recommendation, is that the commission really should be focused on the long term and not have to worry about the short term, because we're never going to be able to be responsive to the legislature.
And I would also, if you go back and look at our charge, we got a lot of work to do. It's going to get touched by the legislature this year.
And if the decision is to rewrite the funding formula.
Correct.
I sure hope this body has played a role in that,
Right.
because we've talked an awful lot about, right? And I think that's where it becomes like, we just need to get out of here by doing something meaningful. And then we've lost all the complexity that we've spent the last 3 months talking about, how it's not just this one thing or this other thing. So I think I like the idea of somebody needs to be empowered, and whether it's the steering group or the chair to, come to committee meetings, meet with legislative leadership, clarify what is this body's role, and go from there.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm worried that there's going to be big conversations this session, and we're not going to be able to say, wait until you get our vision report next December. Just cool your jets, everybody. And that's not realistic.
Yeah. Yeah, and if direction or if action is taken, it's going to direct it's going to take the work in a direction. And if those two things, I hope they're not, but it also should shape our work. Otherwise, we are doing like meaningless work in the corner. We're talking, right, exactly. And that's not, so you will see a revised draft. If people have ideas about how to reframe this part, given what we just talked about, I would welcome them. It's time for public comment. I see one hand on the screen, and then there's at least two in the room. So we'll start on the screen this time. And the DGS, you'll have to introduce yourself. Oh.
Thank you. My name's David Scholes. I'm from Brattleboro. I wanted to point out a couple of things that are missing, and I think they reflect on the credibility of the commission, which you've obviously expressed concern about. I think that this list that you've made, it's a selective list, and it really overrepresents the special interests of the commission members. And I think the two examples that really stick out to me, one is that there's really nothing in it about reorganizing and consolidating administrative centers, even though that's a potential great deal of opportunity for savings. But I think way more important is something that the Finance Committee talked about at length at their meeting last week, and that's the absence of quality monitoring in the system. We have great standards, but we don't monitor them. We don't monitor much of anything. We just don't measure things. And it's different than just having a statement or a principle about school quality. It's different to talk about it and to actually measure it. And just the fact that there's nothing in there that has anything to do with making sure that what's happening in the schools is providing growth and benefit I think it reflects the lack of student voice and parent and public voice on the committee. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Steve Warzak, I'm a retired teacher, former president of the association, served on the Vermont NEA board. Recently, I have been on both the ACSD school board and Hanford Career Center. So I've been involved in negotiations on both sides. I've been involved in many of these difficult conversations. One of the things that I was hoping to hear from this commission was at least give us data to work from, because at the school board level, we are desperate for it. We don't have anything to offer. And when we don't have anything to offer, we often hear emotional appeals that we cannot respond to, because it's the story of, you know, are you going to take away my kid's school, you heartless, you know, insert your pejorative here. And we're sitting there going, the school is going to drop below 30 students and we're spending $1 million on it. And that's spread across the district. So you don't see those pieces. And then when we hear from the legislature and the administration, well, you know, it's the school boards, they're runaway spending. Hands are tied. We don't have any levers to pull. And when we don't have any data back of any decisions, it makes it difficult for us. So I applaud what you're doing. I love the fact that this is actually coming together and different representatives are coming here and you're hearing from lots of different sides. What I would ask to help us do our work, the work of the volunteers that are on school boards that are not getting paid to do this, give us something substantive to work with, give us data, something that we can point to. Does closing a school where the parents have told us, yeah, to keep our school open, we want to have a combined K, 1, 2, 3 classroom with one teacher. How is that helpful? And when we look at the data, and you know, we had to go into an executive session where everything was sealed off to look at data from small schools because the sample size is too small. We couldn't be entrusted with that without signing away our firstborn children to be able to look at educational data. And it was not good. These small schools are not educating kids in the way that we want them to be educating. Small schools are nice, they make people feel safe, but does that impact, as you said, the actual results that are coming out of those schools? Does a small school actually, the value that the community gets from the money that they spend on it, does that make sense? So I hear what you're doing. I hear what you're doing at the 50,000 feet level. I applaud it. I love it. Help us at the local level because we really are caught in between a rock and a hard place. We have parents that hate us and community members that want to elect us off the school board because their taxes are too high. You see the quantity that we're in, and we're not even getting paid to do it. So please try to think of that as well. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to alternate. Mary Gannon.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Megan. Hi, everybody. You've heard me talk about this. My name's Mary Gannon. I'm down in the, I'm a consultant that works with schools, and I'm looking forward actually to the AOE coming to do a listen and learn tomorrow in Brattleboro. So we're looking forward to having that. I just wanted to make a couple points, and I have been a squeaky wheel on the issue around representation. So I appreciate David Scholes, also from the Brattleboro area, again, reminding us all and giving attention to the fact that, you know, I'm still very concerned, as some of us are, about the lack of representation on the commission. So I have said this before, and I will continue to just raise it up, because I know there are partners across the state right now who could very much support the work that you're trying to do and really give some input in terms of the impact on communities who are not represented by the membership of the commission. So I won't belabor that point, but I know there's an opportunity with the community engagement to change that up. But it's glaringly apparent, particularly as you move towards this first draft of the report. The other thing I want to say, when I go back and I was listening to the conversation, which was a bit of time ago now, around the call to action section and the context around the draft report. And, you know, I feel like the call to action, because I was reading that carefully, looking at I didn't feel like it was specific to who the call of action needs to be to. And that we can talk about, like, the involvement of parents, or the involvement of communities, or the involvement of school board members in this conversation and in these really challenging decisions. And yet what I would like to just name specifically as a call to action to the governor and to those in the assembly who don't understand the value of a strong public education system and its connection to the economy of the state. So again, my call to action is to those people who are not prioritizing the system of public education so that we can really thrive and make Vermont a place where everyone wants to come and live. And I'm happy to be put on the record of saying that specifically to Governor Scott. And the last thing I'll say to you all is one of the things I've been also interested in kind of following is under Interim Secretary Saunders and other folks at the AOE, around the ways in which data is being analyzed. So I think, you know, data analysis can also come with a lot of bias, and I'm sure that's not lost on folks in the AOE. And so I wanted to bring your attention to an incredible text. Maybe you can't see it, it might be backwards, but it's called Street Data. And it's a book that really looks kind of at how to do some out-of-the-box thinking around, like, the next generation model for really thinking about the ways that the dominant culture or even dominant public education systems oftentimes are not looking at data analysis through the lens of other people's who are most impacted by education. So for those of you that might be looking for weekend reading or just want to expand your thinking about analysis, I would highly recommend it. It's called Street Data. And I think if you put that in a Google search, you would find that. Again, appreciating all that you're doing and recognize this is very hard, but I think we have some great opportunities here if we can just continue to think how we move outside of our regular thinking about how we support public education. Thanks.
Thanks, Mary. So in the room, Ken?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I thought Friday the 13th was a perfect date for you. But regarding all your concerns about these aren't recommendations, reminds me of back in the day, a lot of newspapers would make a big deal of publishing test scores. And people would just naturally say, oh, how come our school isn't doing so well compared to these schools? And my fellow board members and I would beat our heads against the wall trying to get the message across that these aren't designed to compare schools. They're designed to help districts identify where they need improvement. But I wish you all better luck with your recommendation message, non-recommendation message than we had with that message back then. And lastly, I'll echo Commissioner Castle and Steve here, and I think I've said it myself before. I really applaud you all for your thoughtful work and your transparent work, and I wish you well and continue. I think you've done a great job so far. It's a daunting task, and I wish you well.
Alan? Oh, sorry. Actually, Alan, Elizabeth Burrows' hand was up first. It sort of went down and then back up, if that's okay. And then you next. Elizabeth Burrows, yep.
Thank you very much for full disclosure. And thank you, Alan, for letting me slip back in. I appreciate it. For full disclosure, I am a 12-year-long 12-year-long serving school board member down at Windsor Southeast Supervisory Union. I'm also I'll be entering my third term as a legislator. I just wanted to ask, I just wanted to make a couple of small comments. One is that I thought that I heard you all agree that you were not going to rely on the Pincus report because the Pincus report itself says that it is not adequate for scale for the state of Vermont. But then I heard Senator Cummings mention that the Pincus report is a data, provides data points that force us to take certain actions. So I hope that there's some clarification on the role of the Pincus report at some point. Secondly, I wonder whether there are any plans to discuss the role of the collapse, or the near total collapse of the Agency of Education in the public education's financial straits. And this doesn't have anything to do at all with Zoe Saunders and her capabilities. It's been an ongoing thing as school board members and school administrators and even legislators. We can't know the actual dollar amount that winnowing has cost our state, but every single person on this commission knows that it's high. And I just also want to finally echo also Commissioner Castle's comments. I am a broken record as far as small schools go, but the problem is, or my question is, whether the commission in general understands that prior to Act 46, small schools in small towns were supported by our state. And I'm not really sure I understand. Our local school has had a consistent population student body since 1957 when it was founded, with only 3 outlying years. And it's always been an advantage. And I'm just not sure I understand or whether you understand that they are assets. And I don't see any, when we talk about data analysis, I don't see any analysis. I see data. I don't see any economic analysis, and I don't see any data analysis. And I wonder whether there is actual analysis forthcoming, but also that our small schools in our small towns, taking a look at putting small schools on the chopping block is, small schools are equivocal to small towns, which are the backbone of our state. And unless you have data analysis and data that proves the value of putting them on the chopping block, proves that there is any value past 5 years, because you're supposed to be looking at the future of public education in the state of Vermont. If you can provide that analysis that there is a benefit, then I believe that Vermonters will understand and will not be so guarded about losing their small schools. But until then, understand that they are equivalent to our small towns, and we will be losing those as well. So putting them at the first on the chopping block is always going to be hard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Alan, you'll be our last public comment for tonight.
So I actually had a question about what's going to happen to all the information that's been sent to you from people in comments and public comments. Because one of the interesting things that I've seen evolve over the last few months is that all of a sudden a whole bunch of people, there are a number of armies of us out here, have been looking at this issue and have been doing, in some cases, some pretty amazing analysis of what's happening in small schools, or which schools are the most cost effective, and so forth and so on. And it's really struck me that what you've done is you have reawakened a bunch of people who, after Act 46 said the state doesn't want us anymore, we're going to cut down the number of public people in the public who are involved in our schools, go away. And I think what I've seen over the last few months is a lot of people coming back in the fold and saying, no, this is really important. We want to see how we can all get together and talk about this stuff the way that we used to at school board meetings around the state. I'm wondering if maybe you've considered having a series of forums once the legislature starts, maybe once every 2 weeks, where the commission members would be available for comment, for talking with people, or to make presentations for legislators or for the public, so we can keep this kind of conversation going. I hope that the comments we've all been submitting have been helpful and haven't been critical and haven't discouraged you on the commission, because you've done an amazing amount of work. But there's a lot more work that has to be done and a lot more information that has to be gathered. And I think you should use as much help as you possibly can. Thank you for your work.
Thanks, Alan. Just gonna close public comments. 2 quick clarifications, and then I'm gonna ask the commission what's next. The clarification is any comment, any input from a community member that's sent to me gets sent back to the full commission. And if that comment is also requested to be public comment, it also is included in the public comment record of the following meeting. So just from a clarification standpoint, we get a fair amount of input that is not asked to be public comment, but that still does go to the full commission. The second piece is the executive session today was to select a communication and engagement consultant to help refine and deliver on that portion of our work. So my question to the commission, or I'll start with my worry, we have to get to a different location, ideally take a restroom break, and I am not sure we have time. I do not want to delay that decision making, but I'm struggling to see how we would fit in. But I will go with the will of the commission. We can entertain a motion to go into executive session, or we can table this agenda item and have
I think we give it a shot. How far away are we? It's a walk.
It's just a walk. Yeah.
And it was an indoor ramp to walk up.
Okay.
Can I respond to one of the comments just
Yep.
around the agency? So I look forward certainly to having a follow-up conversation with Representative Burrows to understand her critique around the agency. But I want to be really clear that since being secretary, I've put a very considerable focus on education finance, like as early as this spring, being able to provide some recommendations when we're in a really challenging budgeting situation for many of our districts. And we've invested a lot of additional resources by bringing on some consultants and providing additional training in the field, along with doing agency-wide cross-functional work to ensure that we understand that it's not just an issue around funding. It's an issue around how funding supports programming and opportunities for students. So I just want to be really clear that as secretary, I've been making a big focus on education finance as a means to provide students with the opportunities that they deserve. And we're really proud of the work that we've been able to do and ramping up our focus on that, and including additional reporting and additional training. So certainly, we'll look forward to a further conversation, but just wanted to make note of that it absolutely is a priority and it's an agency-wide focus to support the field.
Thanks, Zoe. Okay, so we'll do this in 2 steps. Can I have a motion to make a finding that premature general public knowledge of the confidential bid materials would clearly place the public body at a substantial disadvantage?
I move to
You
leave
did.
executive session in order on those, on that basis.
Okay, I'm gonna do it in two motions. First, I'll vote on the,
Yeah, I make the motion that you just read.
okay,
I'll second that one.
thank you, Mike.